They found him face down in the irrigation ditch before the frost had lifted. Accident, the report said. But there were marks on both wrists, the kind a fall doesn't leave. 3 weeks later, another man went into the ground. Before the end, he had breath enough for 3 things only. One of them was buried beneath a workshop floor, east corner, under a board cut with a cross. Wyoming, October. Wind coming across dead grass with nothing to slow it down. A bay mare walks into town at an easy pace. Nobody looks twice. That is exactly the point. In the canvas bag, a revolver wrapped in a piece of old flannel that still smells of linseed oil and wood smoke. 3 letters carved deep into the wooden grip, carved by a man who meant them to outlast him. The gun shop door swings open. The bell rings louder than she'd have liked. 3 men turn their heads, and in the back room, the steady sound of metal on metal stops. The morning Wren Calloway rode into Laramie, nobody looked twice. That was the point. She had learned that early. Learned it the way children learn things from fathers who never explain themselves directly. Through repetition, through observation, through the slow accumulation of small lessons that only make sense years after the man who taught them is gone. Ride in slow. Don't tie your horse at the first post you see. Let your eyes do the work before your mouth opens. And never, under any circumstance, let anyone see what you're carrying before you decide to show them. She had been following those rules her whole life without fully understanding why. Now she was 27 years old, 7 months a widow, and the man who made the rules was 3 months in the ground. She still followed them. The horse she rode was a bay mare named Cora. Not a beautiful animal, not by any standard a livestock man would use, but steady and honest and disinclined toward drama, which Wren had always considered more valuable than beauty in both horses and people. Cora picked her way down the main thoroughfare of Laramie with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had seen enough of the world to stop being impressed by it. Past the lumber yard that smelled of fresh pine and old sawdust, past the dry goods store with bolts of calico stacked in the window like a promise nobody was going to keep, past 2 men arguing about something in front of the assay office, their voices loud and their gestures large, and the actual subject of their disagreement completely unintelligible from 20 feet away. Wren didn't slow down for any of it. She was looking for a sign. Briggs & Sons Gun Firearms, Leather Goods, and Repair. She found it halfway down the block, painted in dark green letters on a board that had weathered one too many Wyoming winters. The ampersand between Briggs & Sons had faded almost to invisibility, which struck her as oddly appropriate, given that there were no sons. She knew that already. Gideon Calloway had told her many things in his final weeks, parceling out information with the careful deliberateness of a man who knows he is running out of time and cannot afford to waste a sentence. He had mentioned Callum Briggs twice. The second time he had said, the man never had children. Never wanted them, I think. Or maybe he wanted them so badly he decided not to risk the wanting. Wren had not asked what that meant. She had learned not to ask her father what things meant. He would tell her, eventually in his own time. Or he wouldn't, and the meaning would reveal itself later, in some moment she wasn't expecting, arriving with the particular weight of things that have been waiting a long time to land. She tied Cora to the post in front of the shop, checked the knot twice, not from anxiety, but from habit. The same habit that made her check the loads in a rifle before entering any structure with more than one door. Her father's habits, passed down without ceremony the way most important things are passed down. The morning was cool. October in Wyoming had a specific quality of cold, not the brutal smothering cold of January, but a sharp clarifying cold that made the air feel new. Her breath came out in small clouds. She stood for a moment beside the door of the shop, not hesitating exactly, just collecting herself, settling into the skin she needed to be wearing when she walked through that door. The canvas bag hung from her right shoulder. Inside it, a change of clothes, a tin of hardtack, a small roll of bandages she'd brought more from practicality than premonition, and the gun. The gun. She had wrapped it in a piece of old flannel that had once been part of one of her father's shirts. The flannel still smelled faintly of wood smoke and linseed oil, which was the smell of her childhood, which was the smell of her father, which was... She stopped that thought before it got somewhere. She couldn't afford to go right now. Not here, not in front of a gun shop in Laramie, where she had business to conduct and a specific kind of composure to maintain. She pushed the door open and walked in. The bell above the door announced her, with more enthusiasm than she would have preferred. The shop was longer than it appeared from the outside. That was the first thing she registered. And then the smell gun oil and leather and the faint metallic undertone of iron, a smell that was deeply, almost uncomfortably familiar. Glass cases ran the length of the left wall, rifles and shotguns mounted on pegs above them, revolvers and pistols laid out on cloth inside the cases, with the reverent spacing of objects that know their own value. The right wall held leather goods, holsters, belts, saddlebags, straps and scabbards hanging from hooks, with the ordered density of a well-kept tack room, and at the far end, a door to what was obviously a workshop. Open. The sound of something being worked on, a rhythmic, careful sound, metal against metal drifting out. 3 men near the front of the shop. Not browsing. Exactly. Standing in the way that men stand when they are comfortable in a space and feel no obligation to justify their presence in it. The nearest one, tall, sharp-featured, somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a coat that cost more than Wren's entire winter supply of provisions, was holding a revolver and examining it with the attention of someone who knows exactly what he's looking for and isn't going to find it satisfying. The other 2 were younger, positioned slightly behind the first, the specific arrangement of men who follow rather than lead. The one in the expensive coat was named Harker, though Wren didn't know this yet. She didn't look at him long enough to memorize his face because that would have been the wrong kind of attention. She looked at him the way she looked at everything in an unfamiliar space. Cataloging, filing. Moving on. Behind the counter, a boy, 19 at the outside, maybe younger. Dark hair falling across a forehead, still arranged in the particular optimism of someone who hadn't yet been disappointed enough times to rearrange it. He looked up when Wren entered, and she saw something flicker across his face. Not unkindness, just the faint uncertainty of a young man, not quite sure what category this woman walking through the door belonged to. His name was Pete, though she didn't know that either. She walked to the counter, set the canvas bag down, opened it, took out the flannel-wrapped bundle, and unwrapped it with the same care she would use to unwrap anything she had promised herself she would keep safe. The Remington 1058 Army revolver lay on the flannel between her hands. 44 caliber, octagonal barrel, the steel dark with age, and use but clean, meticulously clean, which told a story about the person who had last maintained it. The hammer was wrong. The trigger assembly had an issue she'd identified by feel 3 weeks ago, but couldn't repair herself without the right tools and more expertise than she possessed. The loading lever had a slight bend she was less concerned about. It was the hammer. It was always the hammer. She placed it on the counter. "I need the hammer mechanism repaired," she said. "The primary spring, I think, but I'm not certain. And the trigger pull is off. It's breaking too early. I'd like it looked at before any work is done." Pete looked at the gun, then at her, then at the gun again. He was about to say something. She could see the sentence forming in his face, the words queuing up when the voice came from behind her. Boy, flat, almost conversational. The voice of a man who has found it useful to never raise his voice, because the people around him have learned to pay attention regardless. "You sure you want to spend time on a gun that ain't worth the leather it's holstered in?" Quiet laughter from the 2 men behind Harker. Not loud, just enough. Pete stopped forming his sentence. His eyes moved from Wren to the man behind her. Calculations running behind those eyes. The calibration of someone who has not yet learned that there are kinds of pressure worth resisting. His hands came off the counter. Subtle, almost unconscious. Wren saw it. She placed her right hand on the gun, not in a threatening way. There was nothing aggressive about the gesture at all. She simply placed her hand on it the way you place your hand on something that belongs to you, which it did. The gesture said, "I see what you just did, and you can do it again if you want, but this is still mine. I'd like it looked at before any work is done," she said again. Same tone, same volume, as if the last 60 seconds had been a brief interruption of no particular significance. Pete looked at her hand on the gun, looked at her face, and then something shifted in him. Small, almost invisible, but she caught it. The faint adjustment of someone remembering something about himself. He reached for the gun. Harker spoke again. "Seems like a lot of trouble," he said, "for a widow's gun." She hadn't told anyone she was a widow. He'd looked at her hands, The calluses, the absence of softness, the particular set of a woman's shoulders when she has been doing the work of two people for long enough that her body has stopped expecting anything different. Some people could read those things. She filed that away. The fact that he could read it, the fact that he'd chosen to say it out loud. She did not turn around. "I'd like it looked at," she said to Pete, for the third time, before any work is done. Pete took the gun, and then the sound from the back workshop stopped. There are moments that don't announce themselves. No shift in the light, no change in temperature, nothing in the air that would tell you, if you were standing in that room, that something is about to happen that will alter the architecture of the next several weeks of your life. The door to the workshop simply opened, and the man who had been working back there simply walked out, wiping his hands on a piece of cloth tucked into his belt. And the moment arrived, wearing the most ordinary clothes it could find. Callum Briggs was 66 years old. He was tall, had been taller probably, before the years began their slow negotiation with his spine. Still tall enough, still carrying himself with the particular straightness of a man who had spent a significant portion of his adult life in situations where slouching was not an option, and whose body had retained the lesson even when the situations had stopped. White hair kept short. A beard, also white, kept shorter. A face that had been lived in thoroughly and showed every bit of the living. Not ugly, not exactly, but with the quality of a landscape that has been worked by weather until it becomes more interesting than anything smooth could be. His right hand was wrong. She noticed that immediately, because she noticed hands. The index finger on the right hand was stiff at the first joint. Damp weather, she guessed, or an old injury that had healed inexpertly. The kind of damage that accumulates in a life spent in the kind of work that makes demands on your hands before it makes demands on anything else. A lawman's injury. The kind that announces its history without explaining it. He wore a leather apron over his shirt. No jacket. No hat. He was a man in his own space, comfortable with the fact of his own space in a way that had nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with simple familiarity. He came out of the workshop, and his eyes went first to Pete, the quick survey of an employer checking on an employee, and then to the gun on the counter. He stopped, not dramatically, not with any kind of theatrical freeze. Just a man who was walking and then was not walking. The stillness arriving so naturally that for a moment it seemed like he had simply chosen to stand still for reasons of his own. He walked to the counter, picked up the Remington. His left hand did the work. The right hand steadied, but the left hand turned the gun, held it, examined it with the fluency of someone who has handled so many firearms over so many years that the act is closer to reading than to inspection. He turned it. Barrel up, barrel down, held it so the light from the window caught the surface of the steel. And then he turned it grip up, and his left thumb moved to the wooden grip, found the initials carved there. 3 letters, deep cut, careful, the work of a man who intended them to last. GWC. His thumb traced them, and Wren watched Callum Briggs go somewhere else entirely. Not obviously. Not in a way the other men in the room would have necessarily noticed, but she was watching his face with the focused attention she reserved for things that mattered, and she saw it. The slight alteration in his expression that happens when something unexpected reaches past your defenses before you've had the chance to construct them. Not pain, exactly. Closer to the expression of someone hearing a song they haven't heard in so long they'd stopped believing they would ever hear it again. 8 seconds, she counted. 8 seconds of Callum Briggs standing at his own counter, holding a dead man's gun, and being somewhere very far away from this shop in Laramie in October of 1879. Then he came back. He looked up, and he looked at her, really, looked at her, for the first time, with the full weight of attention that had previously been directed at the gun. She had seen people look at her in a lot of different ways over 27 years. She had been looked at with desire and with dismissal and with the particular blankness of people who simply could not figure out which category to put her in. She had been looked at by her father, which was its own category entirely, a look that contained multitudes and required no words. This man looked at her like he was looking for something specific, like he was trying to read a signature in her face. "Where did you get this?" Low voice. Even. But underneath the evenness, underneath it, the way a river is underneath ice. In the wrong part of winter, something that was not even at all. Wren held his gaze. It belonged to my father. Callum didn't look away from her face. She got the sense he was a man who had learned long ago that faces told you more than words did, and that patience in reading a face was a skill worth developing, especially when the other person knew they were being read. Pete, he said without looking at Pete. Yes, sir. Go organize the stock in the back room. The Winchesters need re-cataloging. A pause. The Winchesters are all ready, Pete. Another pause. Shorter. Yes, sir. The sound of the boy moving toward the back of the shop. Then Callum turned his attention to the three men near the front. He didn't speak to Harker directly. He didn't need to. He simply looked at him with the particular look of a man who has ended more conversations than he's started, and said to the room in general, in the tone of a man announcing a weather change, I'm going to close the front for a private appraisal. Pete'll refund your deposit at the window before you go. Harker looked at Callum, a measuring look. The specific calculation of a man, trying to determine whether the person in front of him is the kind of obstacle worth engaging, or the kind better walked around. He walked around. The two men with him followed. The door opened. The bell announced their departure with the same enthusiasm it had announced her arrival, and then the shop was quiet. Just the two of them, and the gun between them. Callum locked the front door, turned the sign in the window. Not dramatically, just methodically, the way he probably did everything. Then he walked back to the counter and set the Remington down between them and said nothing, and waited, and Wren understood that the waiting was the invitation. She took a breath. My father's name was Gideon Warren Calloway, she said. The words landed in the quiet of the shop, and Callum Briggs received them the way you receive a blow you saw coming, but couldn't avoid. Absorbing rather than deflecting. The whole body adjusting to accommodate the impact. He didn't stagger. He didn't make a sound. He simply stood very still, and then, after a moment, pulled out the stool from behind the counter and sat down on it. Like standing was a reasonable thing to do when the world was arranged in a way that made sense, and sitting was what you did when it wasn't. Gideon, he said. Not a question. Not exactly. More like a word being verified. Like saying it aloud would confirm whether it was real. Yes. He looked at the gun. He's March of this year. She kept her voice level. She was good at keeping her voice level. It had taken a long time to get good at it. Pneumonia, the doctor said. He went quickly. Callum nodded slowly. The nod of a man adding something to a ledger he's been keeping for a long time. I didn't know he had a daughter, he said. He didn't tell many people. She paused. He didn't tell many people anything. Something that might have been a rueful, almost smile moved across Callum's face. There and gone. No, he didn't. He picked up the gun again. Just held it this time. Not examining. Just holding. The last time I saw your father was the spring of 1871, I thought. He stopped. Reorganized. Started again with more care. There was an incident. Near Powder River. I was told he died in it. He didn't. No, he looked at her. Evidently not. The afternoon light was coming through the front windows at a low angle, the way it does in October when the sun has started its retreat and doesn't have the energy to get very high. It caught the dust motes, moving through the air of the shop and turned them briefly visible. Wren watched them, the small particles of the ordinary world, just floating there, indifferent to anything. He told me to find you, she said. Before he died, he told me to take the gun to Callum Briggs in Laramie, he said. She stopped, because the next part was harder to say than she had anticipated. It had not seemed hard when she rehearsed it, which she had done several times on the 2-day ride from her farm. It seemed manageable then. In the abstraction of rehearsal, he said you would understand. When you saw the gun, Callum looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. It contained, she thought, several things at once. Recognition and grief, and something else that she didn't have a name for. The something else a person carries when they have spent 8 years believing something was one way and are only now beginning to understand it was another way entirely. He was right, Callum said. I understand. He set the gun down, stood up. I need to get something. He went to the back of the shop. She heard him moving, a lock being worked, something heavy being shifted. Longer silence. Then the sound of him coming back. He was carrying an envelope. It was not new. The paper had yellowed at the edges in the specific way that paper yellows when it has been sitting somewhere for a long time, and the ink on the front, an address, a sender's name had faded to the point where you had to look carefully to make it out. But Wren looked carefully. She always looked carefully. The return address read, G. Callaway R2, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. The postmark, February 1879. 1 month before her father died. Callum set it on the counter. I didn't know who it was from, he said quietly. The return address, I didn't recognize the name. Gideon was gone. As far as I knew, he'd been gone for 8 years. And then this arrived and I didn't. He stopped. I hadn't opened it. Wren looked at the envelope. You kept it, she said. I keep everything. He said it without apology. Old lawman's habit. You never know what's evidence until later. She reached out and picked up the envelope. It was lighter than it should have been for something that had been sitting in a locked box for 8 months. Letters always felt like they should have more weight than they did, given what they sometimes contained. She looked at it for a long moment. Do you want to open it? He asked. Not yet. She set it carefully in her canvas bag. I want to tell you what I know first, and then I want to hear what you know, and then I want to open it. In that order. She met his eyes. Is that acceptable? Callum Briggs looked at this woman he had never met before today. This woman who was, it was now becoming clear, the daughter of the best partner he had ever worked with, and the man whose supposed death he had carried like a stone in his chest for 8 years. And he said, yes, that's acceptable. And then, because there was nothing else to do, Wren Callaway began to talk. She had been born in the autumn of 1852 in a town she had never gone back to a woman named Clara, who died when Wren was 7 and left behind no useful information about herself beyond the bare facts of her existence. Clara had been practical and quiet and capable in the specific way that women of that era and circumstance needed to be, and she had loved her daughter in the complete, uncomplicated way of someone who has simplified her life down to what matters. And then she was gone, and Gideon Callaway was left with a 7-year-old girl and a set of skills that were essentially useless for raising one. He had done it anyway. Not elegantly, not according to any conventional standard of what a father was supposed to be or do, but he had done it with the same stubborn thoroughness he brought to everything else. And the result was Wren, which Wren considered as she explained this to Callum, watching his face for the small reactions that told her which parts were landing and which parts needed more detail, a reasonable outcome, all things considered. He had taught her to shoot when she was 8. Not because he had a plan for her. She didn't think her father had plans exactly, as much as he had responses, reactions to the world as it presented itself, but because it was what he knew how to teach. The Remington 1858 had been his gun. The one he'd carried before she was born, before he was whatever he'd been before, which was a thing she'd had to piece together gradually, the way you piece together a map, when the person who drew it is no longer available to explain it. He'd bought her a smaller frame when she was 12, after it became clear that her hands were not going to grow large enough to manage the full size comfortably. He'd kept the Remington for himself. He was careful with it, she said. He maintained it, more carefully than anything else he owned, which wasn't much. She paused. He talked about guns the way some men talk about tools, not as weapons, as precision instruments. He said the difference between a gun that works and a gun that doesn't work when you need it to is the difference between a decision and a tragedy. Callum listened. He was a good listener, the kind who doesn't fill silences because he's uncomfortable with them, but lets them exist if they need to, which is a rarer quality than it should be. She told him about the years after her mother died. The moving. She hadn't fully understood it then at 7, at 8, at 10, she had simply understood that they moved, and that where they were going was always slightly less specific than where they had been, and that her father had reasons for things that he would explain eventually, or not explain at all, but that existed, regardless of whether he articulated them. She had learned to trust the existence of the reasons without requiring their explanation. It was a strange thing to learn as a child, and she suspected it had made her strange, in some ways that she was still discovering. They had ended up in Laramie County when she was 14. Not Laramie itself outside it, 12 miles east on a piece of land her father acquired under the name Gerald Weston. She hadn't questioned the name. She had learned not to question the name. It was just the name they used, the way you use the tool you have, rather than the tool you wish you had. He'd built a house, a small one. He'd broken ground, as homesteaders were doing across Wyoming territory in those years, under the provisions of the Homestead Act. 160 acres, the promise of ownership in exchange for labor and time, and the willingness to stay. He'd built a house and put in a kitchen garden and bought 2 horses and traded occasional labor with the neighboring farms for what he couldn't produce himself. And he had lived that life with the focused simplicity of a man who has deliberately decided not to want more than what fits in 160 acres. Now here was the thing Wren had worked out on the 2-day ride to Larimer. The thing she had turned over and over in her mind until it settled into something she could hold. Her father had arrived in Laramie County in 1866. Callum had met him in 1868, contracted through the marshal's office as a civilian scout, which meant Gideon had been working both lives simultaneously. Farming 12 miles east. Scouting the territory under his real name, or close enough to it, through channels Callum controlled. He had trusted Callum's operation, had not trusted whoever sat above it, which told Wren something useful about where the rot had started. She told Callum none of this yet. She was still listening to her own story, organizing it. Because you could not explain where you were going until you had explained where you had been. Wren had grown up. Met Thomas Calloway, she'd taken his name, which meant she'd gotten the right surname by an indirect route, at a church social in Laramie when she was 19. Married him at 20. Their son Jasper arrived in 1874. Thomas worked the farm beside her father, the 2 men with a comfortable working mutual relationship, and the shared understanding that neither of them was particularly interested in talking more than necessary. Thomas Calloway died in March of 1879. Officially, an accident. He had been working alone near the irrigation ditch on the far east side of the property, and something had gone wrong. And by the time Wren found him, it was too late to do anything but what you do when it's too late. She had accepted the official version for approximately 3 days. Then she had stopped accepting it. What changed your mind? Callum asked. The marks on his wrists, she said. Silence. There were marks on his wrists that weren't consistent with a fall. The doctor noticed them. He didn't say anything to me about it. I found it in his notes, which I wasn't supposed to see, but I saw them. Abrasions, both wrists. The pattern of... She stopped. Started again. The pattern of a man who had been restrained. Callum said nothing. My father was sick by then. He'd been declining since winter. The pneumonia was already in him, though we didn't have the word for it yet. He was in bed more than out of it. When I told him what I'd found in the doctor's notes, she looked at the gun on the counter. He didn't look surprised. That was the thing. I expected him to look surprised. Instead, he looked like a man who has been dreading a specific piece of news for a long time and has finally received it. What did he say? He said, they found out where I am. That was all. I asked him who. He didn't answer. I asked him what they wanted. He said, the land. And then he was too tired to keep talking. And by the next week, he couldn't keep a conversation going for more than a few minutes at a time, and by the end of February, he wasn't. She stopped. Reset. He died in March. 3 weeks after Thomas. The shop was very quiet. 3 weeks before he died, Wren said, he had a good day. Sometimes they have good days at the end. He was clear-headed, more than he'd been in weeks. He called me to sit with him, and he told me 3 things. She held up one finger. He said if anything happened to the land, the first name I should find was Callum Briggs in Laramie. He said to take you the gun. He said you would understand. Second finger. He said there was something under the floor of the old workshop, the one he'd built first before the main house that we'd been using as a storage shed. He said, under the floor, east corner, look for a board with a crosscut mark. He said, don't look for it until you're ready to use what you find, and don't look for it alone. Third finger, he said. She paused, looked at Callum directly. He said he was sorry. He never told me the truth about who he was. And he said that if you were still alive, you probably already knew most of it, and that you deserved to hear the rest. Callum Briggs sat on his stool in his shop in Laramie for a long time without speaking. Wren waited. She was good at waiting. She had been well trained. There are things I know, he finally said, and things I thought I knew, and things I was told, and I've spent 8 years arranging them into a story that made a certain kind of sense, and I think... He stopped, looked at her. I think most of that story was wrong. Tell me the right one, she said. He had been a deputy U.S. Marshal for 14 years. He said it's not with pride. Exactly. but with the measured acknowledgement of a man stating a simple fact about a significant portion of his life. 14 years. Wyoming Territory, starting 1858. The early years had been the rough years. The territory was young. The law was younger, and the gap between what the law said should happen and what actually happened was wide enough to ride a horse through, which many people were doing, regularly, with enthusiasm. He'd found the work suited him. Not because he was a violent man, he was at pains to note this, in a way that made Wren suspect it was something he had thought about carefully, but because he had a specific capacity for patience and attention that made him useful in situations that required more thinking than shooting, which most situations did if you were willing to think. He had met Gideon Calloway in 1868. He came in as a scout, Army, nominally, but his contract was through the Marshal's office. We used civilian scouts for a lot of the territorial work. He knew the country. He knew it the way some people know a language, not like they learned it, but like they were born into it, like it was his native tongue. Callum turned the Remington over in his hands again, not looking at it exactly, just holding it. And he could shoot, which you know. I know. Not just fast, accurate, which is a different thing entirely, and a rarer thing, and more useful. He set the gun down. We worked together for 3 years. He was the best partner I ever had. We didn't talk much, which was fine. Didn't need to. We developed a working rhythm that didn't require a lot of explanation. I knew what he was going to do. He knew what I was going to do. In the field, that's worth more than anything you can put into words. He stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the street. Wren had the sense he was organizing his thoughts, that the view of the street was irrelevant, that he wasn't seeing it. In 1870, we were investigating a land claim dispute in the southern part of the county. Routine at first. Land claims were the most common thing we dealt with. The Homesteads Act had opened everything up, which was the intention, but it also opened up every possible way for the people with money and connections to take advantage of the people without them. Fraudulent surveys, corrupted paperwork, judges with interests in the outcomes of their own decisions. He paused. You understand. Intimately, Wren said. What started as a dispute between two homesteaders turned into something else when we started pulling the thread. The claims they were fighting over had both been filed through the same land office, and the land office was being directed by the same man, and the man was... He stopped. There was a name. A name that kept appearing in the documents, a name that shouldn't have been there, a name connected to several transactions that, on their own, looked like unrelated private business, but together looked like a coordinated pattern of acquisition. Wren said nothing, waiting. Gideon found the thread. I was the one who went up the chain to report it. I went to my superior, who went to his superior, and the message that came back was that we should proceed carefully, that the matter was being reviewed at a higher level, that we should cease our investigation pending review. And you didn't. I did, actually. He said it flatly. That's the part I've had to live with. I followed the instruction. Gideon didn't. Gideon kept pulling the thread. He told me he was going to keep pulling it, and I told him he was going to get himself into something he couldn't get out of, and he said. Callum stopped. Something moved across his face. He said he knew that, but there were families on those 160-acre plots. There were children, and somebody had to keep pulling. The shop was so quiet. Wren could hear the street sounds outside. A wagon wheel. A distant conversation. The particular ambient noise of a small city going about its morning. 3 weeks later, Callum said, Captain Silas Gantry, who was at that time commanding the Territorial's patrol unit that worked alongside our office, came to me with a report. A patrol had encountered a situation near Powder River, an ambush, it appeared. One of the civilian scouts had been killed. He had been carrying a marshal's credential, the name on it. Gideon Calloway, Wren said. Gideon Calloway. He returned to his stool, sat. Gantry presented it to me as a tragedy and a condolence, and I accepted it as such. There was nothing in his manner that suggested anything other than a man delivering bad news he genuinely wished he didn't have to deliver. He paused. Gantry at that time was a respected officer. He later became a judge. The name landed in the room with a particular weight. Silas Gantry, Wren said slowly, is currently the territorial judge for Laramie County. He is. The same man who declared my father dead in 1871. Yes. And who would be the presiding authority over any claim I made to my land? Yes. They looked at each other. Wren thought about her father. 8 years of living under a false name. 8 years of farming 160 acres and building a life as small as possible, under a name that wasn't his, in a county presided over by the man who had arranged his supposed death. 8 years of knowing every day exactly how far the threat was from where he slept. He wasn't hiding from gantry, she said slowly. He was waiting for something. Callum looked at her. What makes you say that? Because he told me where the documents were. He told me what was under the floor. He didn't destroy it. He didn't run. He stayed on that land for 8 years, and he kept whatever he'd found, and he kept it hidden. And then when he knew he was dying, he told me where it was. She met Callum's eyes. He wasn't hiding. He was keeping it safe, waiting for a moment when it could do what he needed it to do. Callum was quiet for a long moment. The envelope, he said, that he sent me. Yes, he sent it in February, a month before he died. He knew in February that the end was coming. He also knew, apparently, that I was still in Laramie, which means he knew where you were. He'd been keeping track of you. Something in Callum's face shifted. Not quite pain, but in the same neighborhood. The expression of a man realizing that something he thought had been lost had actually been watching over him from a distance. The gun, he said. The gun is the key, Wren said. Not literally, but it's what he told me to bring. Not a letter, not a document. The gun, with his initials on it. The gun you would recognize. She picked it up carefully. He knew that if I walked in here with this, you would know who I was. Before I said a word, before I explained anything, the gun would tell you, faster than any letter could, Callum said. Because a letter can be intercepted. Because if someone is watching, you make your way to Laramie. He stopped. They both thought about that at the same time. Wren turned her head slightly toward the front window. The sign still read closed in the glass. The morning street beyond it was ordinary and unhurried. She'd tied Cora to the post. She'd walked in. She hadn't looked behind her on the street. She'd been careful, she was always careful, but she'd been careful about the inside of the shop, not the outside. Old lessons. Applied imperfectly. The man, she said. Harker. He works for Cole Rains, Callum said. Rains represents Northern Rangeland Consortium. They've been acquiring or attempting to acquire homestead properties along the eastern corridor for the past 3 years. Cressy. Properties that sit along the route that a projected rail spur is expected to cut north within the decade. Not a published line. A planned one. The kind that gets planned in legislative offices before it gets announced to anyone who might profit from knowing early. Including my property. Almost certainly. A man came to you with an offer? 2 months ago. $300. Callum made a sound that was not quite a laugh. How much is it worth? The land itself at current rates. He tilted his head. I'd want to look at the survey. But if the rail spur goes where it's projected to go, and if your property is positioned the way I think it is. He paused. More than 300. Considerably more. My father knew that. I imagine he did. He looked at her. He was a scout, Mrs. Calloway. Reading terrain was what he did. He would have understood the implications of the railroad before most of the people in this county started thinking about it. Wren looked at the front window, at the ordinary street, at the world going about its business with its customary indifference. Harker is going to tell, she said. He's probably already told him. He's probably already told him, and they'll want to know why I came to you. They'll make assumptions. Will the assumptions be right? Callum considered. Partly. They'll assume you came looking for information about the land. They won't assume you came looking for your father's old partner. They won't know about your father's real identity. Or at least, I don't believe they will. That would require knowledge that goes back further than Rains's involvement. But Gantry would know. If Gantry is connected to all of this, and I believe he is, then yes, Gantry would know. Wren sat with that for a moment. The web of it. The years of it. Her father farming his 160 acres directly under the nose of the man who had tried to have him killed, preserving documents that could destroy that man, waiting for a moment that didn't come, and then running out of time, arranging things so that the moment would come after he was gone. She thought about what that must have been like. To know. To wait. To watch the threat circle closer every year and have no move you could make that wouldn't bring it down on your family, on your daughter, on your grandson. To have spent 8 years being patient. She understood suddenly and completely where she had learned to be patient. The workshop floor, she said, Yes. I need to go look at it. Yes. You said you'd come. Callum Briggs looked at this woman he had known for approximately 90 minutes, the daughter of his dead partner, the widow of another man's violence, the inheritor of 8 years of deliberate preparation. And he said, I said that. I meant it. He stood up, removed the leather apron, took his coat from the hook by the workshop door, a coat that had seen considerable use and still looked functional despite it. He went to the locked cabinet behind the counter, worked the combination, and took out his own revolver. Not the fastest draw, his right hand would never be that again, but he could compensate with the left. He'd spent 2 years learning to compensate with the left after the right stopped being reliable, because a man in his position did not have the option of simply deciding that the skill was no longer needed. He holstered it. Left side draw. Wren watched, said nothing. He called to Pete in the back, I'm out for the afternoon. Lock up at 5. Don't let anyone in. Pete's voice came back muffled. Yes, sir. Callum looked at Wren. Your horse is outside? Yes. Then let's go. She picked up her canvas bag. The envelope was inside it, unread. The gun lay on the counter, still needing the repair she'd come to ask for. She picked that up too. It belonged to her. It had always belonged to her. She just hadn't known it for as long as she'd thought. They were 2 blocks from the shop when Wren noticed Harker. He was not trying hard to avoid being noticed, which was either carelessness or a message. She decided to treat it as a message. It was almost always smarter to assume competence than incompetence in people who worked in certain lines of work, and a man like Harker, well-dressed, controlled, himself with the particular ease of someone who has been paid to be exactly where he is, was not in this line of work because he was careless. He was across the street, moving at the same pace they were moving, not closing the distance, not increasing it. Following, she said, without turning her head, in a voice calibrated exactly for Callum's ears. And no further. We have company. I know, Callum said. Same register. Eyes forward. What do you want to do? Nothing yet. He kept walking. Knowing we know changes nothing about what we're going to do. We go to the farm. We look at what's under the floor. And then we decide what to do with what we find. Wren thought about that. He'll see where we're going. He probably already knows where you're going. He had access to your horse, your direction, and enough time before we left to send word ahead. He kept his voice absolutely even. They already know about the farm, Mrs. Calloway. What they don't know is what's on it. What your father hid there. She thought about the cross-cut mark on the board, the east corner of the old workshop. 8 years of deliberate preservation. You knew my father for 3 years, she said. Yes, what was he like? Callum was quiet for half a block. Careful, he said finally. Principled, but not loudly. He didn't need other people to know that he had principles, he just had them and acted on them, and that was enough. He found certain things funny that other people didn't find funny, and he didn't explain why he found them funny. And eventually you stopped expecting explanation and just watched for the moment when a small smile would appear, which you knew meant he'd found something amusing that you were going to have to figure out on your own. Wren smiled, very slightly. Yes. He was the kind of man who came back, Callum said, when it would have been easier not to. That's rarer than people think. They walked on. Harker followed. The morning continued around them with its ordinary business. The commerce and conversation and daily momentum of a small city in October, indifferent to the threads running beneath its surface. The threads of 8 years, the threads of land and money, and a name carved into a gun grip. The threads of a man who had decided to come back one last time, in the only way still available to him, through the daughter he had spent his life preparing. Wren Calloway walked toward her farm with the gun in her bag and the unopened letter and 12 miles of Wyoming territory ahead of her, and she was afraid. Not the kind of afraid that makes you stop, but the kind that sharpens you. The kind her father had taught her was the only useful kind. The kind that means you're paying attention. The kind that means you have something worth protecting. She was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. The rest of it she was going to have to figure out as it came. 12 miles is a long way when someone is following you. Not because of the distance. 12 miles on horseback is nothing an hour and a half of easy riding. 2 hours if the ground is rough, less if you push. Wren had ridden that road in every kind of weather and every kind of mood, and she knew every bend and rise and drainage ditch along it with the intimate familiarity of someone who has traveled the same ground repeatedly enough that the ground stops being scenery and starts being vocabulary. The distance wasn't the problem. The problem was the knowing. Because when you know someone is behind you, when you can feel the specific weight of observed attention pressing against the back of your neck like a finger, the road changes. It stops being just a road. It becomes a series of decisions. Every rise that puts you briefly out of sight is a question. Do you use it? Every stand of cottonwoods along the creek bed is a question. Would he expect you to use it or expect you not to? Every flat open stretch, where there is nowhere to disappear to, is a different kind of question entirely. How comfortable are you with being visible? Wren had been asking herself versions of these questions her entire life. She just hadn't known until recently why. Callum rode beside her. Not directly beside her, slightly behind, and to her right, which put her between him and the open country to the west, and put him between her and the terrain to the east where the tree cover was thicker, and someone inclined toward ambush would find more options. She noticed this arrangement immediately and said nothing about it. He'd made the choice automatically, the way you make choices that have been drilled into your body over years of practice, and she understood it as a form of communication that required no words. He was telling her, without telling her, I've done this before. I remember how. Good. She needed him to remember how. Harker stayed far enough behind them to be a presence rather than an immediate threat. A quarter mile, she estimated. Close enough to keep them in sight. Far enough to deny, if necessary, that he was following them at all. She checked behind her twice in the first hour. Casually, the way you check because you're adjusting your hat or looking at a hawk in a distant tree. Not the way you check because you're afraid. There was an art to the backward glance. Her father had taught her that too. Never let them know you're looking. Make the look something else. A turning of the head, natural, unhurried, and in the sweep of that natural unhurried motion, you gather everything you need. Harker. Quarter mile. Riding easy. The second time she checked. Still there. Same distance. Not closing, which meant he wasn't trying to stop them from reaching the farm, which meant he already knew where the farm was, which meant he was watching, not intercepting, which meant the interception would come later, at a time and place of someone else's choosing. She told Callum this, quietly, around the halfway point. He nodded, thought about it for a moment, then said, It changes what we do when we get there. How? Speed. He kept his eyes forward. We don't have the luxury of taking our time. Whatever's under that floor, we find it, we understand what it is, and then we move. We don't sit on the property with it. Where do we take it? He thought about that. Not my shop. If he's already reporting to Rains, the shop is the first place they'll look. Another pause. There's a woman. Meredith Holt. She runs the boarding house on the south end of Laramie. She was a friend of mine once, and she is not a woman who asks unnecessary questions. We can leave things with her temporarily. Temporarily. Everything is temporary, Callum said. The question is whether it's temporary in a useful direction or a bad one. Wren almost smiled. Almost. The farm appeared ahead. She had forgotten, slightly, in 2 days away from it, the specific quality of the place, which was a strange thing to forget. She had lived on that land for 13 years, through every season, through 2 kinds of grief and 1 kind of joy, and the slow, steady accumulation of ordinary days that make up the actual substance of a life. She had walked every acre of it. She knew the north fence line where the grass grew differently because of the underground water, and she knew the place near the eastern creek bed where a family of foxes had their den, and she knew that the kitchen roof needed attention on the eastern side before the real winter hit, and she had not gotten around to attending to it. She knew the land, and still, coming back to it after 2 days in town, she saw it the way she hadn't seen it in years. The way you see things that you've been too close to for too long, when distance briefly returns your perspective. The small house, neat and weathered. The barn, solid despite its age. The old workshop that her father had built in the first year, before the house, before anything else, because he had needed a place to work while he figured out what the rest of it was going to look like. The kitchen garden, going to seed now in October, the last of the season's work, drying back into the earth. 160 acres. Her father had come here under a false name and built this. had put 8 years of his life and his labor into this particular piece of Wyoming territory, had grown old here slowly in the company of a daughter who didn't know his real name, and a son-in-law who didn't know his history, and a grandson who called him simply grandfather, because at 5 years old that was sufficient category. And underneath the floor of the first building he'd ever built here in the east corner, under a board with a cross-cut mark, he had kept what he'd found. For 8 years. Wren tied Cora quickly. Callum dismounted and did the same, and then they both stood for a moment looking at the property with the same shared awareness. Parker was a quarter-mile back and slowing. He wouldn't ride up to the fence. He would stay at a distance and watch, and every minute they spent visible on this property was a minute of information he was collecting. "The workshop," Wren said. "Lead the way." She did. The workshop smelled the way it had always smelled, sawdust and iron, and the faint ghost of linseed oil that had soaked into the walls over years of use. The oil her father used on everything that needed protecting from the elements, which was everything, because the elements in Wyoming were not particularly interested in negotiating. It was not large, maybe 20 feet by 15. One window on the north wall, currently shuttered. A workbench along the west wall. Bare now, she'd moved the tools into the barn after Gideon died, making this space available for storage. Crates along the south wall. Various implements she hadn't found uses for, but hadn't gotten around to discarding. The floor was bare boards, wide cut, the kind of flooring you got when you were building something yourself, with timber you'd milled yourself. And speed was not the primary concern. Each board was its own individual thing. Slightly different width, slightly different color, fitted together with the patience of a man who was going to be standing on this floor for years and wanted it to be solid. She went to the east corner, and she found it almost immediately, because she had been looking with her father's eyes, which were also her eyes, trained to see what was meant to be missed. The cross-cut mark was not dramatic. It was a shallow incision in the wood, a quarter-inch deep, in the shape of a cross. Not a religious cross, just a carpenter's reference mark, the kind of mark you make to indicate a reference point when you're fitting boards together. If you didn't know to look for it, you would never notice it. If you did know, you couldn't miss it. "There," she said. Callum crouched beside her, looked at the mark, said nothing. She got the pry bar from the corner where she'd left it. She'd brought it from the barn before they set out for Laramie 2 days ago, not knowing what she'd find in town, but knowing she might come back needing it. Her father had taught her that. Bring the tool before you know you'll need it. It's easier to carry a pry bar you don't use than to wish you had one when you do. She worked the flat end under the edge of the marked board. Applied pressure. Slow, steady, even not wrenching, because wrenching would damage the board and make noise, and both of those things were problems right now. The board came up with a soft protest of old wood, and underneath it, a space, 6 inches deep, floored with a flat piece of tin again, her father's work, because tin didn't rot and didn't absorb moisture, and would keep what was underneath it dry through Wyoming winters if you fitted it properly, which he had. She lifted the tin. A box, soldered shut, about the size of a large book, 4 inches deep, steel with a hinge on one side and a small hasp on the other, no lock on the hasp, because the concealment was the lock. Anyone who got past the floor and the tin hadn't needed a lock to be deterred, and a lock wouldn't have deterred them anyway. Wren picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Whatever was insist had substance. She stood up, carried it to the workbench, set it down, and then she looked at Callum. He was watching her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, the careful attention of a man who wants to observe rather than direct, who understands that this is not his moment and has made the decision to hold his own impulses back and let the moment belong to whoever it belongs to. It belonged to her. She opened the hasp. Inside, arranged with a neatness that was completely characteristic of the man who had placed them there, were 3 things. The first, a document, folded carefully, protected inside a piece of oilskin, tied with a length of string. She untied the string, unfolded the oilskin, and found inside it 2 separate papers. One was a land grant document, the formal instrument of homestead ownership, stamped with the seal of the Wyoming Territorial Land Office, filled out in ink that had not faded, every field completed. The name in the owner field, Gerald Weston, which was her father's name, which was not her father's name, but attached to it, pinned with a small brad nail, The kind of attachment that says, I know this connection needs to be made explicit. A second document, shorter. A sworn affidavit, notarized by a justice of the peace whose name she didn't recognize, attesting that Gerald Weston and Gideon Warren Calloway were the same individual, that the land grant filed under the name Gerald Weston was the legal property of Gideon Warren Calloway, and that the affidavit had been executed freely and without coercion in the presence of witnesses. Witnesses. Two names, neither of which she knew. But the notary seal was real. She pressed her finger against it and felt the impression in the paper. Real. She set the first document down. The second thing in the box was a contract. Not a copy. The original. She could tell because the paper had that specific texture, the slight roughness of paper that has been handled by the actual parties to a transaction, not reproduced. Multiple pages, folded together, the creases sharp and deliberate. She opened it carefully and read. It took her 3 minutes, which was longer than it should have taken, except that her mind kept stopping at certain phrases and requiring time to process what they actually said before it could move on. The language was legal language, which she had limited experience with, but her father had given her enough education to be functional with written documents. One of the things he had been deliberate about, in a way that had seemed at the time simply like a father wanting his daughter to be capable, and revealed itself now as something more targeted than that. She read and read, and then she set the contract down on the workbench and looked at Callum. "Read this," she said. He came forward, picked it up, began. She watched his face while he read. The same thing she'd done in the gun shop, watching for the small reactions, the tells, the moments where the words on the page made contact with something he already knew. He read more quickly than she had. He'd spent years reading legal documents in his work as a marshal. The language was familiar to him. He turned a page, turned another, stopped at something. "Read that section again." Then he put the contract down and stood very still for a long moment. "Well," he said. "Just that. Well." The word a man uses when a larger word is needed, but the larger word hasn't arrived yet. "Rains," she said. "Rains." And Gantry. He picked the contract back up and found the specific section he'd stopped at. "Here, look at this." She came to stand beside him. "Read where his finger indicated." The contract was, on its face, an agreement between Northern Rangeland Consortium, represented by one Cole Rains, agent, and the Territorial Land Office represented, in his capacity, as authorized judicial overseer of land disputes, by one Silas Gantry, associate territorial judge. The subject of the agreement, the management and resolution of what the contract called contested and disputed homestead claims in Laramie County and adjacent territories. The language was careful, very carefully written. The kind of careful that tells you the person who wrote it knew exactly what they were doing and wanted to be able to argue, if necessary, that nothing in it was improper. But the mechanism it described was not careful at all. Gantry would identify homestead properties that lay in the projected path of the planned rail spur information he had access to through his judicial position and his connections to the territorial legislature. He would then create or facilitate legal disputes around those properties, leveraging the court's authority to extend review periods, delay title confirmation, or find technical deficiencies in the original filings. Properties whose owners couldn't navigate the resulting legal complexity. Most of them couldn't. Most of them were farmers and ranchers who had no legal training and no money to hire any, would effectively be put in a position where selling became their only option. Rains and the consortium would then purchase those properties at prices well below their value. When the rail expansion was announced publicly, the properties would be resold at multiples of what had been paid for them. 11 properties identified by name in the contract. Her father's property was the 7th on the list. 11 families, Wren said. At minimum. This was written 3 years ago. There may be more since. Gantry had access to information about the railroad before it was public. His position gave him access to territorial legislature communications. The expansion route was under discussion for years before any public announcement. Anyone inside that conversation knew well in advance. And he used that information to make himself and Rains very wealthy. At the expense of, Callum set the contract down. At the expense of people who had no idea what was happening, who just knew that suddenly their title was in dispute, and the court kept delaying their hearing, And then a man showed up with a check. Wren thought about the man who had shown up at her door 2 months ago. Polite, well-dressed, $300. She thought about what $300 would have done for her. 7 months a widow, a farm with a partially damaged barn, and a roof that needed work, and a 5-year-old to feed, and a winter coming. $300, she thought about all the other families who had looked at those checks and done the math of their circumstances. She thought about how many of them had been offered checks after their circumstances had been made worse by methods that didn't show up in the paperwork, like the marks on Thomas Calloway's wrists. The third thing, Callum said. He was looking at the box. She had almost forgotten the third thing. She reached in and took it out. A sealed envelope. The word on the front, in her father's handwriting, read. She stood holding it. The first time he had put things in writing for her. The first time in 27 years that she had received written communication from her father. Which meant that everything before this, all the lessons, all the careful preparation, all the years of teaching her things, without explaining why she was learning them, had been the real letter. And this was just the postscript. She didn't open it immediately. She put it in her canvas bag, alongside the other envelope, the one addressed to Callum, still unread. She picked up both documents from the workbench, the land grant with the affidavit, and the contract. She folded them carefully and put them in the bag as well. "We need to go," she said. "Yes. Harker is still out there. Still. Yes. He's going to follow us back. He's going to try." She looked at him, at the particular quality of that last sentence. The way it didn't say, "He won't succeed," just "he's going to try." "What are you thinking?" she asked. Callum looked at the window, shuddered. A line of October light coming through the gap at the edge. "I'm thinking about what your father would do. He would use the terrain." "Yes." Callum nodded once. Slowly, he always used the terrain. The terrain in this particular instance was a dry creek bed. It ran roughly north-south, about half a mile east of the farmhouse, in the depression between two low ridges that most riders avoided because the footing was unpredictable and the banks were steep enough to cause trouble if your horse wasn't careful. Wren's horses were careful. She had made them careful because she lived 12 miles from town on a property that required occasional movement in bad conditions, and a horse that wasn't careful about footing was a liability she couldn't afford. She knew the creek bed the way she knew everything on her property, including the place about a mile north where the bank on the west side had eroded enough that a horse could come up out of the bed and onto flat ground without having to scramble a natural exit point, invisible from the main road, useful if you needed to be somewhere that wasn't where people thought you were going. She explained this to Callum in approximately 40 words. He listened, nodded once, said, 15 minutes from now. They spent those 15 minutes doing things that needed to be visible. Wren went to the house, which was what anyone watching would expect her to do, because it was her house and is inside, moved with quiet efficiency. She found Jasper where she'd left him, with Mrs. Alderman from the neighboring farm to the west, the arrangement she'd made before going to Laramie. The weight of a 5-year-old waiting at home, pressing against the underside of everything she'd been thinking and doing for 2 days. Jasper was in the kitchen, eating something, covered in flour, in a way that suggested he and Mrs. Alderman had been keeping busy. He looked up when she came in. "Mama." Just that. Just the word. The simplest word in her vocabulary, and also the most complex one, because it contained everything she was protecting, and everything she was afraid of losing, and everything she had decided, quietly, during the 2-day ride from Laramie, that she was not going to allow herself to lose. She crouched down, held his face in both hands. "I need you to go with Mrs. Alderman for a little while longer, to her house." He looked at her with the focused seriousness of a 5-year-old being addressed as someone whose opinion matters. "Is something wrong?" "Some things need to be sorted out. I'm going to sort them out." "Is the man outside part of the things?" She stilled. "What man?" "The man on the horse. Far away, I saw him from the window. He's been there a long time. 5 years old. And already noticing what he was supposed to notice. Her father's blood. He's just someone passing through," she said, which was the kind of not quite lie that children accept from parents because they trust the larger truth underneath it, that the parent knows what the child doesn't, and the parent will handle it. "Go get your coat," he went. She stood up. Mrs. Alderman was looking at her from across the kitchen with the expression of a woman who has been a neighbor long enough to understand the shape of a situation without being told its contents. "You'll take him tonight?" Wren asked. "Long as needed." Mrs. Alderman set down her cup. "You need anything else?" "I need you to go out the back. Through the garden and over the fence, not past the front. Take Jasper that way." Mrs. Alderman looked at her for a moment, then nodded once with the calm practicality of someone who has lived in Wyoming territory long enough to understand that sometimes the back way is simply the better way. No further explanation required. Jasper came back with his coat already on, correctly buttoned, which he had learned to do himself in the last month. The kind of small developmental achievement that under normal circumstances would have made Wren's chest expand with a specific pride. Under these circumstances, she noted it and filed it, and told herself she would have the feeling properly later when there was room for it. She hugged him once, hard, the way she let herself hug him, when she thought no one was watching, without reservation, without the management of emotion that the rest of her day required. He hugged her back with his whole small body, the way children hug when they don't yet know the hugs are supposed to get more restrained. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said, which was something she'd told him when he asked once why she always said it. "You say it so they know. You say it so they carry it with them." He carried it with him out the back door. She watched him go. Then she turned around, picked up her canvas bag, and went back out to Callum. The exit from the creek bed worked exactly as she had described it. Harker, she calculated, was watching the road north toward Laramie, the obvious route back. The creekbed exit put them a half-mile east of the road, on terrain that was mostly open grassland with scattered juniper, moving north at a pace that kept them below the sight lines of anyone on the main road. They rode quickly but not frantically, the pace of people who know where they're going and know approximately how much time they have. Neither of them spoke much. There was the kind of quiet between them that she associated with her father, the quiet of people who understand each other's purposes and don't need to fill the air between those purposes with sound. She had grown up in that quiet. She knew its quality. It was not the quiet of people who have nothing to say. It was the quiet of people who are saving their words for when words will do something. At some point, she said, "He taught you that. The terrain thing." Callum didn't answer immediately. They rode another 50 yards. Then, the first time I saw him use it, I thought it was luck. The second time, I thought it was instinct. By the third time, I understood it was a method. He paused. He'd say, "The land is always telling you something. Most people are too busy moving through it to listen." He said that to me, too. "How old were you?" 9, I think. "Did you understand it then?" "No." She looked out at the grassland around them, the way it rolled, the way the juniper marked the lower ground, the way the light caught the top of each small rise and left the hollows in shadow. "I understand it now." They came back onto the main road a mile north of where Harker was, presumably still watching the farm. Laramie was ahead. Meredith Holt's boarding house was a 2-story building on a street that was quiet in the way that streets at the south end of small cities are quiet, residential, settled, the noise of commerce a block away, and therefore present but muffled. The house itself was large by local standards, painted a pale yellow that had faded to something closer to cream, with a porch across the entire front and a side yard where someone kept a kitchen garden with considerably more ambition than Wren's. The garden was putting on its autumn decline with great dignity. Callum tied his horse at the post. Wren did the same. "You know her well?" Wren asked. "I knew her husband better. Ben Holt died 11 years ago. She kept the house going herself. She's sharp and she's reliable, and she doesn't have any sympathy whatsoever for people who think the law is something other people have to follow." He went up the porch steps. She also, as it happens, does not like Cole Raines. He attempted to acquire the property next door 2 years ago through methods she considered irregular, and she said so to his face at a town council meeting. He knocked. Is a level of directness I have always admired. The door opened. Meredith Holt was perhaps 60, with gray hair pinned up in a manner that suggested she'd once done it decoratively and had long since simplified to functional without feeling any loss. She looked at Callum with the expression of someone who is not surprised by his presence, but not entirely expecting it either. "Callum." "Meredith. I need to ask a favor." She looked at Wren. The look was direct and assessing, and entirely without the performative uncertainty that some people used when meeting strangers. She was just looking, directly, taking the measure. "Come in," she said. They stayed 20 minutes. Callum explained the situation in the compressed and precise manner of someone accustomed to briefing people who needed enough information to make decisions without enough time to absorb everything. Meredith listened without interrupting, which Wren noted with appreciation. They left the steel box, from under the floor, now holding the documents with Meredith, in the care of a woman who, Callum said quietly on the porch as they left, had survived 11 years of widowhood in a territorial city by being considerably more resourceful than anyone looking at her yellow house, with its respectable porch, would think necessary to deduce. Back on the street, the afternoon light was beginning its autumn angle, lower and more golden than midday. Wren looked at Callum. He looked at her. "Now," she said, "we figure out what to do with what we found." What they found needed someone in a position of authority who was outside the jurisdiction of Silas Gantry. That was the essential problem, stated as simply as possible. Within Laramie County, Gantry was the presiding authority over precisely the kind of legal questions that the contract raised. A challenge to the consortium's land acquisitions, a fraud claim against the methods used, a dispute over the contested titles, all of it would land on Gantry's desk, would be reviewed by Gantry's court, would be subject to Gantry's judgment, which was the same as saying nowhere to go. Except, the contract was a federal matter, as much as a territorial one. The Homestead Act was a federal statute. The sale of public lands and the disposition of properties to which the United States government had a direct interest was not purely a territorial matter. A scheme that manipulated federal land records for private gain had federal implications, regardless of which court tried to claim jurisdiction over it first. "The U.S. Marshal's office," Callum said. They were sitting in the back room of his shop. Pete had locked up and gone home. The front door was bolted. The sign still read "closed." The back room was the workshop, a large table in the center, tools hung with the orderly logic of someone who uses them all regularly, a small stove in the corner, putting out reliable heat. Callum had made coffee, strong and adequate, and entirely without ceremony, which was appropriate. "The U.S. Marshal's office," she repeated. "Wyoming Territory has a marshal appointed by the federal government, not connected to the territorial court in the way that Gantry is, a separate chain of authority." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "His name is Jonas Devereaux. He's based in Cheyenne. He took the appointment 2 years ago, which means he came in after Gantry's scheme was already running, which means he's less likely to be entangled in it. Less likely. Nothing is certain, but Devereaux has a reputation for running a clean operation. He came up through the system in a different part of the territory. He doesn't owe Gantry anything." Wren thought about it. "Cheyenne is 2 days by horse, by a rider who's pushing. Can you get a letter onto the train?" Callum looked at her. "I could, but a letter can be intercepted." "I know." She turned her cup in her hands. "Raines has resources. We have to assume he has people at the station. He has people in most places where information moves. Then we need a person, not a letter. A person he doesn't know, or doesn't know to watch." They both thought about that for a moment. And then Wren thought about Amos Pruett, Deputy Amos Pruett, 40 years old, 18 years as a lawman in Laramie County, 8 of those as deputy under the current sheriff, a man whose loyalties Wren had not had occasion to test and was therefore not inclined to rely on. Amos was the deputy who showed up to take statements after Thomas died. He had been thorough and quiet, and he had noted the marks on Thomas's wrists in his report. The report she had not been supposed to see, but had seen because she had gone into the sheriff's office 2 weeks later on an unrelated matter, and the file had been sitting on the table, and she had looked at it because she had taught herself to look at everything. He had noted the marks. He had noted them and included them in his official report. And then, as far as she knew, nothing had been done about it, which could have meant many things. Could have meant the sheriff had reviewed the report and dismissed the marks as irrelevant. Could have meant the report had been reviewed by someone with an interest in its conclusions being favorable to certain parties. Could have meant Amos had noted the marks and then stopped noting things for reasons he had not explained to anyone. He had a wife, 3 children, a steady job in a county where steady jobs were not abundant. She didn't know what kind of man he was. She needed to find out. "There's a deputy," she said. Callum looked at her, waiting. Amos Pruitt. He took Thomas's case. He noted things in his report that I don't think his superior would have wanted noted. And then, as far as I know, he said nothing further about it. She set her cup down. I want to talk to him. What makes you think he'll help? I don't think he'll help. I think he's afraid of what helping would cost him. But I also think he's a man who has been carrying something uncomfortable for 7 months. And carrying uncomfortable things for long enough changes you. She looked at Callum directly. My father carried uncomfortable things for 8 years. It didn't make him a coward. It just made him patient. Until patience wasn't the right tool anymore. Callum considered this. Pruitt could warn Rains. If he's deep enough in it. He could. But he didn't destroy the report. He could have. And if he'd wanted Rains to know what Thomas's wrists looked like, he would have told him directly. He wouldn't have needed to go through me. She picked her cup back up. He's not their man. He's just not sure what he is yet. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then that assessment. Is that from experience or instinct? Both. She drank the last of the coffee. My father said there was no difference between those two things, if you'd been paying attention long enough. She found Amos Pruitt the next morning. Not at the sheriff's office. She had enough sense not to go there, where the wrong person might see her and report back to whichever authority that wrong person served. She found him at the place she'd identified, after asking Mrs. Alderman. In a manner so casual, it appeared to be simple neighborly conversation. The feed store on the east side of Laramie, where Pruitt picked up a sack of grain most Friday mornings because the feed store's owner gave him a better price than the one on the west side. And Amos Pruitt was a man with a wife and 3 children who noticed the difference between good prices and bad ones. It was Friday morning. She was there when he arrived. He was a broad man. Not tall average height, maybe an inch under, but solid in the way that people who work physical jobs for decades become solid, the weight distributed by use rather than accumulated. Dark skin, a short-cropped beard going gray at the jaw. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned not to waste effort. He wore his deputy's badge, which made him visible, which made him findable, which was, she reflected, either a quality of courage or a quality of habit, and possibly both. He saw her when he came in. His face did something careful. Not surprise, exactly more like the expression of a man who has been half expecting a particular conversation and is not entirely relieved that it's arrived. He picked up his grain, paid for it, turned to leave. She stepped into his path. Not aggressively. Just she was there. In the way that a person who needs to have a conversation with you is simply there, without the option of pretending otherwise. Mrs. Calloway, he said. Deputy Pruitt. She looked at him evenly. I'd like 5 minutes. I'm on duty. The feed store is 2 blocks from the sheriff's office. You're here on personal business. You have 5 minutes. He looked at her for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, which she respected. He wasn't hiding that he was calculating, which meant he wasn't trying to deceive her about his uncertainty. He was just a man working through a problem with inadequate information. All right, he said. They went outside. Stood on the side of the building, out of the main thoroughfare, in the space between the feed store's wall and the stack of empty grain sacks, waiting to be taken around back. Not hidden and visible enough that no one could claim anything clandestine was happening, but quiet enough to talk. She didn't ease into it. She had learned from her father that easing into things was a form of disrespect because it implied the other person couldn't handle the direct version. I found what my father hid on the property, she said. Amos went very still. A contract between Cole Rains and Silas Gantry, detailing an arrangement to manipulate homestead land titles in advance of a planned rail expansion. She's watched his face. 11 properties named. Mine is the 7th. He said nothing, but something in his face had shifted, the specific shift of a man hearing something confirmed that he had suspected but had not been certain of. You already knew some of this, she said. It wasn't a question. He breathed out slowly. I knew something was wrong with your husband's case. I didn't know. He stopped. I knew what the marks on his wrists meant. I'm a lawman, Mrs. Calloway. I've been one for 18 years. I know what that kind of marking means. And you reported it. I reported it. His jaw tightened very slightly. And then the sheriff reviewed my report and told me the marks were consistent with the fall, that the physical evidence was ambiguous, that unless I had further evidence supporting an alternative conclusion, The case was closed as accidental. And you accepted that. The tightening again. More visible this time. I have a family. The sheriff has been in this county for 11 years. Gantry has been on the bench for 8. I'm one deputy in an arrangement that doesn't leave much room for— He stopped. For what? For being right. When being right makes powerful people uncomfortable. She looked at him, the way she had learned to look at people when she needed to see them clearly without judgment, because judgment closes things, but also without the kind of sympathy that implies she was going to let him off the hook. I know what it costs, she said. I'm not asking you to risk your family. I'm asking you to send a letter. He looked at her. By personal courier. Not through the postal system. Not through anyone connected to the county. A private letter to Jonas Devereaux at the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne. Signed with your name. In your capacity as a deputy who noted specific evidence in an official investigation that was subsequently dismissed by your superior without adequate justification. She held his eyes. Your name makes the letter credible. It's a lawman reporting a concern about the integrity of a legal proceeding. That's exactly the kind of thing Devereaux's office is supposed to receive and act on. Amos was quiet. And if Gantry finds out, then Gantry finds out that you wrote a letter raising a professional concern about a case review, which is something you are legally entitled to do, which is not, on its face, insubordination. She paused. The only way it becomes dangerous to you is if Gantry is already dirty enough to retaliate against a deputy for raising a question. And if he's that dirty, you're not safe regardless of whether you write the letter. He looked at her for a long time. She waited. My father spent 8 years not sending the letter, she said quietly. Not as an accusation, just as a fact. He thought he was protecting his family by staying quiet. And then someone came for Thomas anyway. She didn't look away from Pruitt's face. The silence doesn't protect anyone. It just lets them choose the timing. Something moved through Amos Pruitt's face. She saw it not pain, but recognition. The specific expression of a man receiving a truth he has already known somewhere underneath everything else, and has been doing the work of not quite acknowledging. He looked down at the grain sack in his hands. He looked back up at her. I'll write it, he said. The letter was written that afternoon. Callum provided the paper. Amos wrote it in Callum's back room, at the workbench where Callum repaired guns, using a pen that needed to be dipped every second line. He wrote without drafting and without erasing, in the direct and specific manner of someone who had decided to say a thing and was now simply saying it. Wren read it when he was done. It was good, better than she'd expected. He stated the facts. He named the evidence. He identified the reviewing authority. He raised the specific question, given the physical evidence observed and documented, is the official conclusion of accidental death sustainable? He signed it with his full name and his deputy's identification number. She folded it, addressed it, sealed it. The courier, a young man Callum knew, one of several he used for the kind of business that didn't need to go through official channels, because in 14 years as a lawman he had learned that official channels were essential in principle and problematic in practice, left for Cheyenne within the hour. Amos went back to work. Before he left, he paused at the door to the workshop. Turned back, looked at Wren. The sheriff is going to know you came to town. He's going to know you went to Meredith Holt's. He has ways of knowing things. He paused. Be careful. I know. She looked at him. You have a wife and 3 children. Yes. Go home tonight. Tell her you love her. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. My father didn't, she said simply. He kept saying he'd tell her when things were better, and then they were never better. And then she was gone. She looked at the folded letter in her hands. Tell her. Amos Pruitt left. The back room of the gun shop was quiet. Callum was at his workbench, doing something with his hands, not a specific task, she thought. Just the motion of a man who thinks better when his hands are occupied. She sat on the stool across from him. The canvas bag was beside her. The 2 envelopes were inside it, both still sealed. She thought about opening them. She thought about it for a long time. Then she opened her father's letter first. It was short, which was characteristic. Gideon Calloway had never used more words than a thing required. If he could say something in 3 sentences, he didn't say it in 5. She had spent her childhood wishing he would sometimes say a thing in more sentences, because the density of what he compressed into 3 could be difficult to fully absorb. She was older now. She understood it differently. The letter read, Rin, I should have told you sooner. I told myself I was protecting you by not telling you, which is what people tell themselves when what they're actually doing is protecting themselves from a harder conversation. I know that now. I knew it for a long time before now, and I was still a coward about it, which is not something I've been about many things. But there it is. Your mother knew everything. She knew who I was and what I'd been, and why we were moving and why we couldn't use my name. She didn't complain about it, and she didn't hold it against me, and she was in this, as in most things, better than me. You have your mother's patience, and my stubbornness, which is probably exactly the combination you're going to need. The contract under the floor is the record of what they're doing. It's not everything, but it's enough. It was enough in 1871 when I first found the threads of it, and it's enough now. What it needs is the right person to look at it. Callum Briggs is that person. I don't know if he's still in Laramie. He was, last I checked, which was more recently than he probably knows. If he is, he'll understand the contract. He'll know who to take it to. The two of you together can do what neither of you can do alone. I kept this land because leaving it felt like letting them win. Maybe that was pride. I've had trouble telling the difference between pride and principle my whole life. Ask Callum, he'll tell you. I was not a perfect father. I was too quiet when I should have been louder, and too certain about some things I turned out to be wrong about. And I spent a long time keeping secrets that I should have shared with you because I thought keeping them was a form of love. It wasn't. The teaching was the love, all of it. The shooting and the writing and the reading and the patience and the way you always look at a thing twice before you decide what it is. That was the love. You don't need my permission for what you're about to do. You never needed my permission for anything. But for what it's worth, you have it. Be careful. Not because I doubt you. Because the world makes demands that outrun even the people most capable of meeting them. I'm proud of you. I should have said it more. Your father. She read it twice. She sat with it in her hands for a long time after the second reading. Callum was not looking at her. He had understood, she thought, that she needed the time without being observed, and he was giving it to her with the same ease he gave everything, without announcement, without drama, just the quiet act of being present in a way that asked nothing of her. She folded the letter, put it back in the bag. He wrote about you, she said. Callum stopped his hands. He said, the two of us together can do what neither of us can do alone. She looked at him, and he said if I wanted to know the difference between his pride and his principle, I should ask you. Something moved across Callum's face. The specific expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for years and is not sure whether what he's feeling now is the weight being lifted or simply the exhaustion of having carried it. He was proud about the land, Callum said, after a long moment. He thought leaving it was the same as admitting they'd beaten him. That was the pride. He paused. The principle was different. The principle was that there were other families on those properties. Other people who didn't know what he knew, and if he left, if he took what he'd found and just disappeared again, then the thing he'd found would disappear with him. He set down whatever was in his hands. The land kept him there. The other families kept him honest about why. Wren thought about that. So the pride and the principle pointed in the same direction, she said. They usually did. With him. A pause. That's not always a virtue. But it was with him, mostly. She picked up the second envelope, the one addressed to Callum, in her father's faded handwriting, with the February postmark. She held it across to him. He looked at it, at her, at the envelope again. Then he took it. He didn't open it immediately. He held it the way she had held hers, the acknowledgement that certain things deserve a moment before you look at them. Then he broke the seal. She looked away while he read. Gave him the same thing he had given her. When he was done, she heard him exhale a long, slow breath, the kind you take when you've been holding something in your chest for a long time and have finally located the release. She didn't ask him what it said. He looked up. His eyes were dry. He was not a man who cried, or at least was not in the habit of doing so, but they had that quality of redness at the edges that happens when you don't cry but come close. He said the weather that day near the North Platte crossing was clear, Callum said. He wanted me to know that for the record. He said every time he told the story to anyone, which was, he admitted, not often, it had gotten a little wetter. He wanted to correct the record before he wasn't able to. She recognized what that meant. because she had told him about the rain. He told me the story 3 times, she said. By the end, it was a storm. Callum nodded. He said he was sorry for the 8 years. He said he knew I would have helped him if he'd come to me. He said he was afraid that helping him would have cost me everything I'd built, and he decided, without asking me, that the choice was not his to make for me. Another pause. He said he was probably wrong about that. He said he usually was about the things he decided unilaterally in the name of protecting other people. The room was quiet. He was right that he was wrong, Callum said. But I understand why he did it, which is different from approving of it. And I think he knew I would understand, which is probably why he could say it. Wren nodded. They sat in the workshop with the stove ticking and the afternoon light going golden through the small window, and the presence of a man they had both loved, in different ways, at different distances, filling the room in the way that the dead fill rooms when the people who love them are in the same place, thinking about them at the same time. It was Pete who broke it. The sound at the front of the shop, a knock, specific and urgent, the kind of knock that contains information about the emotional state of the knocker before the door is opened. Callum was on his feet before Wren had fully processed the sound. He went to the front, opened the door. Pete stood on the porch. His face was the face of a boy who has done something he understood was wrong at the time, and has been carrying the understanding of it since then, and has now reached the point where the carrying has become heavier than the concealment that made it necessary. "Mr. Briggs," he said. He looked past Callum to where Wren stood behind him, and then because Pete was 19, and had not yet learned the art of controlling what his face said, his expression said everything. The guilt. The specific guilt of someone who knows they have made a choice that hurt people they did not intend to hurt and have come to find out how much damage they have done. Callum opened the door wider. Pete came in. He had copied the return address. That was all he had done. He said it plainly, without elaboration, standing in the middle of the gun shop, with his hat in his hands, and his eyes moving between Callum and Wren in the manner of someone uncertain which of the two was the more dangerous judgment he was facing. He had seen the envelope when it arrived in February. He had read the return address, G. Calloway, RR2, Laramie County. He had known the name Calloway because the name was known in certain circles connected to the land acquisition work, which he had known about because a man who worked in Raines's office had been a regular customer at the gun shop, and the man had talked not carelessly, carefully, in the way that people share information when they want someone to understand which side has the better prospects. The man had given Pete $20 in July to pass along any information that came through Briggs's shop related to the Calloway property, or that name. Pete had been watching since. When Wren had come in with the gun, he had seen the return address on the envelope and understood the connection, and he had written down the address and given it to the man from Raines's office. He had done this while Pete was preparing to help her, which was why he had stopped preparing to help her, because he had already made himself useful to the other side and couldn't look directly at both things at once. He said all of this in the middle of the gun shop with his hat in his hands. Then he stopped talking and waited. Callum looked at him for a long time. Then he went behind the counter, opened the drawer, took out $20 and put it on the counter. Pete stared at it. "That's your back rent," Callum said, "and your wages through the end of the month." He kept his voice completely even. "Raines's man knows about the farm. He knows Mrs. Calloway came to this shop. He does not know from you what was under the floor of the workshop, or what was in the envelope." He waited. "Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." Pete's voice was very small. "I didn't know about any of that." "Then the damage is contained." He looked at the young man. Raines already knew about the property. He had the name. What you gave him was confirmation that Mrs. Calloway was looking for something, which he might have guessed anyway. A pause. "You told me when you could have stayed quiet. That matters. You're not firing me?" "I already did." He indicated the money. "Pete, you're 19 years old. You made a decision from a position of desperation, and you came here to tell the truth about it when you didn't have to. That tells me something useful about you." He held the boy's gaze. "But I need you to understand that there are people involved in this who will use you in ways that are considerably worse than giving you $20, and that staying in this situation on either side is not good for you." Pete nodded. His jaw was tight. "Is there somewhere you can go?" Callum asked. "Family. Another town. Somewhere that isn't Laramie. I have an uncle in Rawlins. Go to Rawlins." Tonight if you can. Tomorrow morning at the latest. He kept his voice even, not because you're in danger, necessarily, but because the situation here is going to develop in directions you don't want to be standing in the middle of. Pete looked at the money on the counter. He looked at Wren. She looked back at him, steadily, without anger, because anger at a frightened young man who had made the wrong choice from desperation was not a thing she had the energy to sustain or the belief that it would be useful. Go to Rollins, she said. Tell your uncle you needed a change of scenery. He picked up the money. He left. The bell above the door marked his departure. Wren and Callum stood in the quiet shop. He gave them confirmation, she said. Yes, which means Raines knows we're looking for something. He doesn't know what we found. Not yet, but he'll move faster now. Whatever he was planning to do next, he'll do it sooner. Probably. Callum went back to the workshop. She followed, which means we also need to move faster. Devereaux is at least 2 days away. We've sent the courier. We can't accelerate that. What we can do, Wren said, is make sure there's nothing on the property that they can use as leverage. Jasper is with Mrs. Alderman. The documents are at Meredith Holt's. The letter is on its way. She looked at the workbench. What else do they have? What else can they take? Callum thought about it. The land itself, he said. They can't take the land. The title is documented. They can make the title contested. Gantry can. The affidavit ties the land grant to my father's real name. It's notarized. It has witnesses. She leaned against the wall, thinking, Gantry can challenge it. But he'd have to do it in open court. And if Devereaux has received the letter and is looking into Gantry, opening a contested title proceeding right now is the last thing Gantry wants to do. Unless he doesn't know about the letter. He doesn't. Not yet. They looked at each other. So we have a window, she said. A short one. Then we don't waste it. That night she slept at Meredith Holt's boarding house. Not because she had asked to. Meredith had simply looked at her, near the end of the day, with the assessing look she seemed to apply to most situations, and said, You're not riding 12 miles back to an empty house tonight. The corner room is available. Wren had considered protesting. She had been too tired to do it effectively. The room was small and clean and had a window that looked out onto the side yard with its ambitious garden. The bed was narrow, but the quilt was heavy, and the October night pressed cold against the window glass, and she lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Laramie, settling into the night a distant door. Someone's dog. Far off, the far-off sound of the train that had arrived from Cheyenne and was now at rest in the station. The courier was on his way. Devereaux was somewhere to the south, in an office she had never seen, unaware that a letter was coming. The documents were in a steel box in this house. Her father was 3 months in the ground. She lay in the narrow bed, and she thought about what it had cost him. Not just the 8 years she had been thinking about the 8 years for months now, turning it over, the mathematics of sacrifice and calculation and the choices a person makes when every option is bad, and the question is which bad option you can live with. But reading the letter had changed the abstraction into something with weight. He had been afraid. That was the part she hadn't fully absorbed until the letter. He had been afraid. The man who had never appeared afraid of anything, who had stood in her memory as a figure of composed capability, the person who always knew what to do and did it, without demonstrating the cost of the decision, had written, at the end of his life, Plainly, I was a coward about this. She didn't believe he was a coward, but she believed he had been afraid, because those were different things, and she thought it was important to understand the difference. She thought about Jasper, 5 years old, already noticing things she hadn't taught him to notice, already asking the questions that showed he was paying attention. She thought about what it meant to raise a child in circumstances that required concealment, not to lie to him, exactly, but to protect him from certain truths until he was old enough to carry them. Her father had waited until he was dying. She had thought for a long time after March that he had waited too long. Reading the letter, she was not sure it was that simple. Some truths need to arrive at the moment when the person who receives them is ready to use them, not just ready to know them. There was a difference. She thought her father had understood that difference and had been trying imperfectly, because everyone trying to do a difficult thing in difficult circumstances is imperfect to calibrate accordingly. She could argue with the calibration. She could wish he had found a different way. But she was lying in a boarding house room in Laramie instead of on her farm 12 miles east, because she had what she needed when she needed it. The gun had been there. The address had been there. The documents had been there. He had built the conditions for what she was doing now over years, and the building had been careful, and the result was that she was here instead of somewhere worse. That didn't make it not cost anything. It just meant the cost was worth examining honestly before she decided whether to resent it. She thought she was not going to resent it. The wind had picked up outside. The window glass rattled slightly. Somewhere down the street, a sign was swinging on its bracket, the rhythmic creak of metal moving in the cold. She thought about what her father had said, "You have my stubbornness and your mother's patience." She thought about what Callum had said. He was the kind of man who came back. She thought about the specific quality of what it meant to come back. Not to arrive, which was easy, just presence, just being somewhere, but to come back, to choose the harder direction, to turn back toward the thing you had already passed, rather than continuing forward into the easier distance. Her father had done it at the end, in the only way left to him. She intended to finish what the turnings back had started. She closed her eyes. She slept. The next morning brought three things, in order. The first was a visitor to Meredith Holt's front door. Early before most of the other boarders were at breakfast, a boy, maybe 12, with an envelope. No return address. No name on the outside, just the word, Mrs., written in handwriting she didn't recognize. Meredith brought to her at the breakfast table. Inside the envelope, a single line. "They know you went to Pruitt." No signature. She read it twice, set it down on the table, drank her coffee. It could have been from Pruitt himself, a warning, dispatched quickly, before any consequences arrived. It could have been from someone else, someone watching, someone whose identity and allegiance she couldn't immediately determine. The warning itself was clear enough. If they knew she'd gone to Pruitt, they knew someone was talking to official channels. And if they knew that, they would accelerate, which she had already anticipated, which didn't make the acceleration less real. She ate the rest of her breakfast. The second thing was Callum arriving at the boarding house at 8 o'clock, with the particular air of a man who had not slept well, but was not going to discuss it. He sat down at the table. Meredith directed him to, and Wren handed him the anonymous note without preamble. He read it, looked at her. Pruitt? Possibly. Or someone watching Pruitt. Or someone watching me. She set her cup down. "It doesn't change what we're doing. It just confirms they're watching. You're not rattled." It wasn't a question, more like an observation with a slight undercurrent of surprise. "I grew up in rattling circumstances," she said. "You get used to the feeling." He looked at her with that expression she was getting better at reading, the one that contained her father. "What else?" he asked. "I need to go back to the farm today." He waited. "There are things I need to do. The house is mine, and I intend to keep it, and keeping it means not abandoning it. Jasper will need to come home eventually, and if Raines's people are watching, which they are, me staying away from the property looks like retreat. I won't retreat." She kept her tone completely even. "I'll go out this morning, work the property, come back to town before dark. I'll come with you." "You don't need to. Your father." He stopped. Started again. "You are the person you are, partly because your father taught you. And your father taught you those things, partly because I wasn't there to help him when he needed it, and he had no one else." He looked at the table briefly, then back at her. "Let me help now." She looked at him. "There was a category of help that you accepted, not because you couldn't do without it, but because refusing it would be a kind of cruelty, a denial of the thing being offered, which was not just assistance, which was also, underneath the assistance, the specific and particular repayment of a debt that the man offering it had been carrying for 8 years. "All right," she said. They rode out together. This time, no one followed, which was, in some ways, more concerning than being followed. When you can see the surveillance, you can account for it. When it disappears, you have to decide whether it's gone or just invisible. And invisible surveillance is the kind that surprises you. Wren rode with that consideration running under her awareness, the way you run a background calculations is on the state of the sky when you're working outside. Not consuming attention, just present. The farm looked the same as it had yesterday. Of course it did. Farms don't change overnight unless something has been done to them. She did a careful circuit of the perimeter before dismounting. Just the habit of someone who doesn't want to be caught off guard by something she could have seen from a distance. Nothing had been done to it yet. She worked. This was the third thing the morning had brought, the simple grounding fact of labor. She did not stop being Wren Calloway with a contract in a steel box and an anonymous note in her pocket, and an uncertain number of days before a U.S. Marshal arrived from Cheyenne. But she also at the same time became Wren Calloway, who had a property that needed attention before winter made the neglect expensive. Both things were true simultaneously. She repaired the fence section on the north line that had been needing it since July. She cleared the drainage channel on the east side of the house that had been backing up in heavy rain. She pulled the last of the kitchen garden, the dried stalks and spent vines, the work of cleaning up what the season had done so that next spring had a clear start. Callum worked beside her. He was not a farmer, but he was a man who understood labor, who had spent enough of his life working with his hands that he knew how to be useful without being told every step of what to do. He took direction without making it a negotiation. When she pointed at the fence line and explained what was needed, he found the wire and the pliers and did it. At some point in the late morning, while they were working on the fence in the north corner, he said, without preamble, in 1871, when Gantry came to me with the report, "I want you to know I didn't suspect him." Not immediately, he was. The performance was very good. He seemed genuinely regretful. He seemed like a man delivering news he hated delivering. Wren was working the wire through the post. Okay, I've spent 8 years deciding whether that means I was naive or deceived, whether I missed something I should have seen. He worked the pliers, and I still don't know the answer. I've looked back at it from every angle. I can't find the moment where the lie was visible, which is either evidence that I was deceived effectively or evidence that I was looking away when I shouldn't have been. She fed the next length of wire. Which do you think it is? I think both can be true. He tightened the attachment. A good deception works because the deceived person has a reason to want to believe it. And I wanted to believe Gideon had died in an ambush because the alternative that he was alive and had chosen not to contact me was painful in a different way, a more complicated way. He straightened up. Gantry saw that, I think, and he gave me the story I was most inclined to accept. Wren looked at him. He was very good at reading people, she said. Gantry. Yes, which is part of what makes him dangerous. He's still dangerous. He is. Callum looked at the fence line, straight now, properly tensioned. But he's operating in the dark. He knows we have something. He doesn't know what. He doesn't know that Devereaux has been contacted. He paused. Every day that passes before he knows the scope of it is a day we have. Then we use the days. She moved on to the next section of fence. He followed. They were on the south side of the property, mid-afternoon, when she heard the horse. Single rider, coming in from the road. The particular sound of a horse moving at a purposeful pace, not the ambling walk of someone passing by, but the directed trot of someone who knows where they're going and is going there. She straightened, looked. The rider came through the gate. Harker, alone. He came across the field toward them at the same unhurried trot, stopping his horse 15 feet away, with the ease of someone who has no particular concern about what reception he's going to receive. He looked at Wren, looked at Callum, looked at the work they were doing, the fence, the tools, the ordinary labor of a farm in October. Mrs. Calloway, he said. Harker, she said back, because she knew his name now. Callum had told her, and using it was a specific kind of signal. It said, I know more about you than you might expect. He received the signal. A slight shift in his expression. Mr. Raines has a revised offer, he said. Given the complexity of the current situation, he reached into his coat pocket, took out an envelope. He thought it might be more efficient to communicate directly. He held out the envelope. She looked at it. She looked at him. She did not reach for it. Leave it on the fence post, she said. Something moved through Harker's face. Not anger, he was too professional for anger to show. More like the recalibration of someone encountering a resistance they had not estimated quite correctly. He rode to the fence post, left the envelope balanced on top, turned back. He'd also like you to know, Harker said, in the same even tone, that the matter of your husband's death has been reviewed by the appropriate legal authority and closed as accidental. Any attempt to reopen the proceeding would require extraordinary new evidence and would be reviewed, of course, by Judge Gantry. Wren said nothing. He thought that was relevant context for your decision-making. It is, she said. Thank you. Another micro-adjustment in his expression. He had expected either fear or defiance. She had given him acknowledgement, which contained neither. Harker looked at Callum. Mr. Briggs, Mr. Rains has great respect for your history in this county. He'd hate to see that history complicated by an association that turns out to be a pause, calculated, unproductive. Callum looked at Harker with the specific look of a man who has, in his career, faced down a considerable variety of threats of varying sophistication and is engaged in the comparative evaluation. Much obliged, Callum said in a tone that communicated the precise opposite of obligation. Harker turned his horse, rode out through the gate, gone. The silence after his departure had a specific quality, the particular silence that follows a demonstration of force, however politely packaged. The silence of the air after a shot that didn't quite hit. Wren walked to the fence post, picked up the envelope, opened it. Inside, a bank draft, Northern Rangeland Consortium, made out to Wren Calloway, in the amount of $1,500. She turned it over, looked at the back, looked at the front again. 5 times what he offered 7 months ago, she said. He's scared, Callum said. Simple. Even. He doesn't look scared. He sent Harker instead of coming himself, and the number went from 300 to 1,500 in 24 hours. He came to stand beside her. That's fear, dressed in better clothes than most fear wears, but still. She folded the bank draft, put it in her coat pocket. She did not tear it up. Not because she was considering accepting it, she wasn't, but because it was a piece of paper with Rains's signature on it and his organization's seal on it, and pieces of paper with those things on them were, in the current circumstances, worth keeping. 2 days, she said. Devereaux has the letter in 2 days, and then we wait for him to decide what to do with it. 2 days, Callum agreed. She looked at the property around her. The work they'd done today, the fence lines straight now, the drainage clear, the garden stripped clean and resting. The house, solid. The barn, solid. The workshop where her father had built, the first thing he'd built here, where the floor had kept his secret for years and years. She had decided something, standing in the east corner of the property that morning. She had decided it the way she made most decisions, not with drama, not with internal announcement, just quietly, the way a door closes when the hand that was holding it finally lets go. She was not going to run. She was not going to sell. She was not going to be a story that someone else wrote about her. She picked up her tools. Let's finish the south fence, she said, before the light goes. Callum picked up his tools. They worked. That evening, back in Laramie, Amos Pruitt came to Callum's shop. He knocked the way he had knocked, before the specific knock of a man who has something to say, and is not going to wait indefinitely to say it. Wren opened the door. He came in, looked at both of them. His face had the particular tension of a man who has been holding information and has decided the holding is over. Devereaux is coming, he said. She went very still. A rider came through today. Not through the sheriff's office privately. To me directly. He took off his hat. Devereaux received the letter. He had, apparently, already been looking at Gantry in connection with a separate matter. Something from the other county. He paused. He's coming himself. 2 days. Maybe less if he pushes. 2 days. Or less. She looked at Callum. Callum looked at her. Outside, Laramie was settling into its evening noise, the saloon down the street, the horses on the thoroughfare, the last of the day's commerce completing itself. The ordinary sound of a place that did not know it was sitting on the edge of something that was about to resolve. Gantry doesn't know, she said. More statement than question. Not from me, Amos said. And not from anyone who knew about Devereaux before today. Because I've only told you. Rains will find out, eventually, yes. How long before Gantry? I don't know. Could be hours. Could be tomorrow morning. Amos held her gaze. If he knows Devereaux is coming before Devereaux arrives, he'll try to create an official record that preempts whatever Devereaux is coming to look at. He can file a formal dispute of the title. He can put it in front of any judge in the county, except himself, which makes it look proper, and that judge owes him, which makes the outcome certain. Amos put his hat back on. He can make your title legally contested before Devereaux walks in the door. Wren looked at the workbench, she thought. Callum said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing when she needed to think. The documents at Meredith Holt's. The affidavit tying the land grant to her father's real name. The contract between Rains and Gantry. If Gantry filed a formal title dispute, the contest would be between his official process and her documentation. and her documentation, while real and substantial, would be in front of a judge who owed Gantry, reviewed in a court that Gantry presided over, in a county where Gantry's network ran deep. Unless the contract, she said. Amos looked at her. The contract is not just evidence of what they did. It's evidence of what Gantry is. A judge using his official position to direct land acquisition for personal gain is not a contested civil matter, it's a criminal matter, a federal one. She looked at him. If I file the contract today, not through the county court, but directly, through the federal system, if I can get it into an official federal record before Gantry files his dispute, then the federal record takes precedence over the county proceeding, Callum said. Yes, the nearest federal filing office is right here in Laramie, Amos said. The land office on the north end. It handles federal homestead filings, and it reports directly to the territorial land commissioner, not to the county court. He paused. Gantry has influence there, but it's indirect influence. He doesn't own the clerk. Do you know the clerk? I know of him. Name is Whitmore. He's been there 12 years. He's the kind of man who follows procedure because he believes in procedure, not because he's been told to, not because he's afraid of the consequences of not following it, because he genuinely believes it's how things should work. Wren looked at him. Those are the most useful people in the world, she said. Yes, Amos agreed. They usually are. She was already standing, already reaching for her coat. I'll need the documents from Meredith's. I'll get them, Callum said. Already moving. The land office closes at 5, Amos said. She looked at the clock on the workshop wall. 4:17. Then we move now, she said. They moved. Callum to Meredith Holt's for the box. Wren to the land office, with Amos, because a deputy walking beside her to the federal land office was not invisible, it was deliberate, a declaration in plain sight, and she had decided that the time for moving quietly was over. If Raines's people were watching, let them watch. Let them report back. Let Raines understand that whatever he was going to do, he was going to do it in the open, in front of witnesses, against a woman who was not interested in doing anything in the dark anymore. The land office was on the north end of the main street. A modest building, modest in that particular federal way, built to be functional and credible rather than impressive. The architecture of an institution that has decided its legitimacy doesn't need ornamentation. Wren opened the door. Amos came in behind her. The clerk Whitmore, 12 years at his post, a man who believed in procedure, looked up from his desk. He was perhaps 55, with the organized desk of someone who has processed a large quantity of documents over a long career and developed systems for managing the processing. Mrs. Calloway, Amos said. She needs to file a federal claim document. Whitmore looked at Amos, looked at Wren. What kind of document? Wren put the canvas bag on his counter, and she looked at him with the look she had inherited from her father, the look that said, I have something important to tell you, and I am going to tell it to you directly, and I need you to be the kind of person who can hear it. A homestead affidavit, she said, and a request for federal review of a land acquisition pattern in this county. She held his gaze. I have documentary evidence that requires federal jurisdiction, and I have approximately 40 minutes before your office closes. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the clock. Then he said, Sit down, Mrs. Calloway. Let me see what you have. Callum arrived 6 minutes later, slightly out of breath, with the steel box. They laid the documents on Whitmore's desk. All of them. The land grant with the affidavit. The contract between Raines and Gantry. The notarized witness statements. The bank draft from Raines, which was, she had decided on the walk over, its own kind of evidence. It documented what they were willing to pay, which documented what they believed they stood to gain. Whitmore read. He read with the thorough, unhurried attention of a man who has spent 12 years understanding that the difference between a document properly processed and a document improperly processed was sometimes the difference between a family keeping their home and losing it. He read for a long time. The clock ticked toward 5. He looked up. This contract, he said. This is an original document. Yes. Signed by Gantry. Yes. He looked at it again. Then at her. You understand that filing this initiates a federal review process that I am not able to stop or redirect once it's in the system. I understand. And that Judge Gantry will be informed that a filing has been made. Yes. She held his eyes. He'll be informed after it's in the system. Which is the point. Whitmore looked at the clock. Back at the documents. Back at the clock. He made his decision the way people who believe in procedure make decisions, not dramatically, not with visible internal struggle, but with the particular quiet efficiency of someone who has identified what the correct action is and is simply doing it. He reached for his stamp. The stamp came down on the first page of the contract with the solid authority of a federal seal. It was 4:53. The filing was in the system. They walked out of the land office into the October evening. The air was cold. Stars were beginning in the east, the first ones always appearing in the east before the west has given up on daylight. The street was still active, the hour between work and dark, when people moved between purposes. The transitional momentum of a day resolving into an evening. Amos Pruitt stopped on the porch. He looked at Wren, and at Callum, and at the building they had just left. "Gantry is going to know by morning," he said. "Yes, and Devereaux's is 2 days, maybe less." She looked at him. "You sent the letter. You came here tonight. When this is done, when Devereaux arrives and looks at what's been filed, your name is on record as the deputy who initiated the federal inquiry." Amos nodded slowly. "There are ways that helps you," she said, "and ways it doesn't." "I know. Thank you," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has done something he should have done 7 months ago and is uncertain whether the delay disqualifies the doing. She looked at him back with the expression of someone who has thought about the ways people wait too long to act and has decided that the acting, when it finally happens, matters more than the waiting. "Go home," she said. "Tell her." He nodded once. He walked down the steps and into the street and toward his home. Wren stood on the porch of the federal land office in Laramie, Wyoming Territory, on an October evening in 1879, and she watched him go. The evening was very cold. The stars were coming in fast now, the way they do when the sky is clear and the temperature is dropping. Callum stood beside her. She could feel the distance, closing on whatever it was they were, waiting for Devereaux coming from the south. Gantry learning what had been filed, Raines recalculating, all of it converging on a point she couldn't see yet, but could feel the approach of the way you feel weather before it arrives. She had done what could be done. Now it was about holding. "Come on," Callum said. "It's cold, and Meredith keeps the stove in the parlor going until 10. She looked at the street, the evening, the first full scatter of stars overhead. Then she pulled her coat closed, and she walked back toward the boarding house, through the cold October dark, toward whatever was coming. The night before Devereaux arrived, nobody slept. Not Wren, not Callum, not Amos Pruitt, she suspected, in whatever house he shared with his wife, and 3 killed Wren children on the quiet residential end of Laramie, where the streets were named after trees, and the noise from the saloons didn't reach. Not Gantry either, probably. Because Gantry knew. She had expected him to know by morning. He knew by 9 o'clock the previous evening, which was faster than she'd calculated, and told her something useful about the density of his network, the specific kind of useful that lands in your stomach like a stone and stays there. Meredith Holt had come to her room at 9:15, knocked twice, waited, came in with the manner of a woman delivering information she considers it her duty to deliver, regardless of whether it will be welcome. Gantry's clerk was seen leaving the land office 20 minutes after it closed, Meredith said, walking directly to Gantry's house on Thornwood Street. Wren had been sitting on the narrow bed with her father's letter in her lap, not reading it, just holding it, the way you hold something that has weight you want to keep feeling. "How do you know this?" "Because I have lived in this town for 31 years, Meredith said, without any particular emphasis. "And I know what movements look like when they're not casual." Wren nodded. "Thank you," she said. Meredith had looked at her for a moment, the direct, assessing look that seemed to be her primary mode of engaging with the world. Then she had said, "The stove in the parlor will be lit until midnight, if you need to think somewhere warmer than this room." And she had gone. Wren had thought in the parlor until 11. Then she had gone back to her room and lain in the dark and done the specific kind of not sleeping. That is actually a form of preparation, the mind moving through scenarios, possibilities, contingencies, the quiet work of a person who has learned that you don't stop thinking just because you've closed your eyes. Morning arrived the way October mornings in Wyoming arrive. Not gently, just suddenly present, the sky going from black to gray to the particular cold pale blue of high altitude, early light, no gradation, no ceremony. Just Here it is. Another day. Get on with it. She was dressed and downstairs before Meredith had the coffee made. Callum arrived at 7. He looked like a man who had done his own version of not sleeping alert, functional, carrying the night's work behind his eyes without it slowing him down. He sat at Meredith's table and accepted the coffee and looked at Wren across the table with the expression she had come to recognize as his thinking face. Gantry hasn't filed anything, he said. How do you know? I was at the land office when Whitmore arrived this morning. I asked him directly. Nothing has come through the county court. No title dispute, no emergency filing. She turned that over. Why not? 2 possibilities. He looked at the table. Either he doesn't know the full scope of what we filed, he knows something was filed, but not what it contains, and he's waiting for more information before he moves. Or he knows exactly what we filed, and he's decided that a counterfiling would draw more attention than staying still. He looked up. A contested title proceeding is public record. If he initiates it now, with a federal review already in the system, he's putting his name next to ours in an official document at precisely the moment when someone from the federal marshal's office is on his way to look at official documents. Wren thought about that. He's calculating, she said. He's been calculating for 8 years. He's very good at it. So he's waiting. He's waiting. She drank her coffee, the kind that didn't apologize for itself. Then we wait too, she said. And we don't give him anything new to calculate with. The waiting had a texture. Not the waiting she was familiar with, the waiting of farm life, which is mostly waiting for weather or season or the slow work of growing things to complete itself. Waiting that is productive because you are always doing something else while you wait. This waiting was different. This was the waiting of a held breath, the waiting of a situation that has been set in motion and cannot be stopped, but has not yet arrived at its destination. She went to the property. Not because she needed to, the work from yesterday was sufficient for another week at least, but because she needed to be somewhere that was hers, somewhere that had the physical reality of what she was protecting. The house, the barn, the old workshop with its cross-cut mark now visible because she hadn't bothered to replace the board, the kitchen garden stripped bare, waiting for spring. She walked the whole perimeter, all 160 acres, which took most of the morning. She thought about Thomas, who had worked this ground beside her without knowing the full weight of what they were standing on, who had been gentle and practical and had loved her and Jasper in the uncomplicated way of someone who takes the people in front of him seriously, who had died in a drainage ditch because someone with power and money had decided that his death was a useful tool for applying pressure. She stood in the east corner of the property for a long time, where the creek bed ran below the bank, where the grass grew differently because of the underground water her father had found by reading the ground. She had thought, in the weeks after Thomas died, that grief was the primary thing she was carrying. And it was real. It was present. It was the thing that woke her at 2 in the morning and sat with her until the sky lightened. But underneath the grief, and she had only understood this recently, in the last few weeks, since all of this had started moving underneath it, was something else. Something that wasn't grief and wasn't anger, exactly, though it contained both. It was the refusal, the specific and personal refusal to be a story that someone else wrote about her, the woman who sold, the woman who left, the woman who took the money and disappeared and became, in the official record, simply a number one more transaction in a ledger that Rains and Gantry kept somewhere clean and organized and devoid of the actual human cost. She was not going to be that. She had never been going to be that. She had just needed a few months to find the proof. She was back in Laramie by early afternoon. The word arrived at 2 o'clock. Not through Amos, not through Callum, through Meredith Holt, who seemed to receive information the way certain people do, through a network of relationships built over 3 decades that operated with the quiet efficiency of something that had never needed to announce itself because it had always simply worked. Meredith came into the parlor where Wren and Callum were sitting. "There's a rider," Meredith said, "coming in from the south on the Cheyenne Road. 2 men. Moving fast." She looked at Wren. "One of them matches the description of a U.S. Marshal." Wren looked at Callum. Callum looked at his watch. "Faster than expected." "He pushed," Wren said, which meant Devereaux had received the letter and considered it urgent, which meant the letter had been sufficient, which meant Amos's name and his careful official language, and the specific credibility of a deputy raising concerns about a proceeding he had been directly involved in, had done exactly what she had hoped it would do. She stood up, started gathering the documents. "Where are you going?" Meredith asked. "To meet him." Meredith looked at her. "You're going to meet a federal marshal on the street." "I'm going to meet him before Gantry does," Wren said. "Which is different." She met Jonas Devereaux on the south end of Main Street. He was not what she had expected, which meant she had been expecting something and had been wrong, which was useful information about the limits of her imagination. She had pictured someone in his 50s. Devereaux was perhaps 45, lean, a face that had seen considerable weather and had the lines to show it. He rode a gray horse that was as road-tired as he was, and considerably less interested in hiding it. His deputy rode 2 lengths behind him, young alert, watching the street, with the focused attention of someone who has been told to watch the street and takes the instructions seriously. Devereaux saw Wren before she spoke. He pulled up. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Not a question," marshaled Devereaux. She stood in the street without stepping back, which was a choice she made consciously. "I'd like to speak with you before you go anywhere else in this town." He looked at her for a moment, at Callum, standing slightly behind her, at the street around them. "All right," he said. He dismounted. "Talk?" She talked for 20 minutes. Standing on the south end of Main Street in Laramie, Wyoming Territory, in October of 1879, with her father's documents in her hands and a federal marshal in front of her who had ridden hard from Cheyenne because a deputy's letter had told him something he needed to hear. She didn't ease into it. She started at the beginning, which was 1871, which was Gantry, which was her father's disappearance, and the 8 years underneath a false name and the steel box under the workshop floor. And she moved through it in the ordered, precise manner of someone who has arranged facts for presentation and knows which ones are load-bearing and which are detail. Devereaux listened the way he probably listened to everything, without interruption, without visible reaction, with the contained attention of someone who is gathering information and has decided that gathering is more useful right now than responding. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Then, the contract. You have the original. Whitmore at the land office has it in the federal filing system. You can retrieve it with your authority. The affidavit connecting the land grant to your father's real name. Same location. And the anonymous note." He looked at her. "Someone is uncomfortable with the situation." "Yes. I don't know who sent it. I know it was accurate." Devereaux looked at Callum. "You were deputy marshal here." 14 years, Callum said. "I worked with her father from 1868 to 1871. I received the report of his death from Gantry directly." "You believed it." "I believed it for 8 years. A pause. "I believe the alternative now." Devereaux nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man completing an assessment. "Gantry knows something has been filed," Wren said. "Yes. He'll know by now that you're in town." "Probably." Devereaux looked at the street, the direction of the courthouse, the direction of the land office. "He'll be arranging his response." He turned back to her. "Which is why I'm going to the land office now. Before he does whatever he's decided to do." He looked at her directly. "You've done the work, Mrs. Calloway. The rest is mine to handle." She looked at him. There was a moment, a specific, identifiable moment, where she had to decide whether to trust that sentence, whether to hand the weight of the next stage over to this man she had met 12 minutes ago and whose judgment she was evaluating based on the quality of his listening and the fact that he had ridden hard from Cheyenne because he'd taken a letter seriously. She thought about her father, who had not handed anything to anyone, who had carried it alone for 8 years because he had not trusted anyone to carry it with him. She thought about what that had cost. "All right," she said. What happened next took 3 hours. Devereaux at the land office, his deputy at the courthouse, pulling records. Whitmore producing the filed documents with the careful efficiency of a man who has been waiting for someone with the right authority to ask for them. The federal seal on the contract, the affidavit, the chain of evidence that her father had built and she had delivered, and the system, the real system, not the corrupted local version of it, was now receiving. She did not go to any of those places. She went back to Meredith Holt's. She sat in the parlor. She drank coffee that went cold before she finished it. Callum came back at 4 o'clock. He didn't say anything when he came in. He sat down across from her. He looked like a man who has witnessed something that has resolved a long tension. Not celebration, not relief exactly, but the specific quality of a problem that has been handed to the right place, finally being in the right place. Devereaux sent a deputy to Gantry's house, he said. She waited, not to arrest him, to inform him that a federal inquiry has been initiated and that his cooperation is required. He paused. Gantry was apparently the deputy described it as composed, which means he was terrified. What did he say? He said he would cooperate fully. Callum looked at her, which is what a man says when he understands that the only remaining decision is how this ends, not whether it ends. Wren sat with that. And Rains? Devereaux is handling Rains separately. The federal jurisdiction covers the land fraud, the conspiracy to manipulate homestead titles, the acquisition pattern, the connection to the rail expansion information. He paused. Rains is going to need a lawyer. Several, probably. And the kind of money that buys several lawyers is also, it turns out, the kind of money that makes you a useful example when the federal government decides it needs to make an example of someone. She thought about Rains, the polite voice, the $1,500 bank draft, the man who had come to her door 7 months ago and made an offer that, to a widow with a farm and a 5-year-old and a Wyoming winter coming, must have looked like a reasonable number, must have looked like the only number. She thought about how many other doors he had knocked on. The other properties, she said. The other 11 families. Devereaux is aware. Callum looked at her steadily. The contract names them, which means there's documentation, which means they can be contacted. He stopped. Started again. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be fast. Some of those families have already sold. The land is in other hands now. Unwinding that is the work of courts and time. Not one afternoon. But it's possible. With the right evidence and the right authority, yes. Possible. He held her eyes. Not certain, but possible. She looked at the cold coffee in her cup. My father would say, possible is enough to start with, she said. He would, Callum agreed. And he would have been right. Gantry did not fight it. That was the part that surprised her, when she learned it. Not the outcome. She had been prepared for any outcome, because preparation is not the same as certainty, and she had learned the difference between those things early, but the manner of it. He was, by all accounts, simply cooperative, immediately and completely cooperative, as if he had been waiting not for justice, but for the conversation to finally be direct, as if the pretense had become more exhausting than he'd anticipated, and he had been, in his own terrible way, ready for it to be over. Devereaux told her this later, not with any particular judgment, just as information, factual, contained, trusting her to do her own evaluating. She didn't know what to do with that picture of Gantry, the man who had ordered her father's apparent death in 1871, who had spent 8 years building a system that stole land from families who couldn't fight back, who had, and she was certain of this, certain in a way that didn't require a court to confirm it, arranged for Thomas to die in a drainage ditch because Thomas's wife happened to be someone inconvenient. That man had simply cooperated. She thought about it for a long time and could not arrive at a feeling about it that felt adequate to the facts. Anger wanted a target that pushed back. Grief wanted something to be irretrievable. What she found instead, when she looked at the simple fact of Gantry cooperating, was something closer to exhaustion on his behalf, the exhaustion of a man who had spent decades holding up something that was always going to come down and had finally let it. She did not forgive him. She did not need to forgive him. Forgiveness was a private matter, and this was not a private matter. This was a legal matter, and a matter of consequence. And the consequence was coming regardless of what she privately felt. But she stopped expecting the anger to complete something. It didn't complete anything. The land was still hers. Thomas was still gone. Her father was still in the ground. The anger was real and appropriate, and entirely beside the point of what needed to happen next. What needed to happen next was not about Gantry. Cole Rains left Laramie 2 days after Devereaux arrived. Not voluntarily, in the company of Devereaux's deputy, bound for Cheyenne and the federal court system that was now very interested in his activities. Harker was gone before that, disappeared from Laramie sometime in the 48 hours after the filing, which was the specific kind of disappearance that told you a man had assessed his position and decided that the assessment was not favorable and acted accordingly. There would be a warrant. Devereaux had said so, in the matter-of-fact manner he had for things that were going to happen. It would take time. She was not responsible for Harker's warrant. She was responsible for her own 160 acres. The two things occupied different categories in her mind, and she was intentional about keeping them separate. She told Jasper on the third morning. Not everything. She was not her father. She had decided that the calibration would be different, that the silence would not be the method, that Jasper was going to grow up knowing what was real, even when what was real required, adjusting for a 5-year-old's capacity to hold it. But not everything yet. Because 5 years old was 5 years old, and there are things that wait. She sat him down at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, with the morning light coming through the east window and a bowl of oatmeal in front of him that he was eating with the focused seriousness he brought to most physical tasks. She said, "Some people tried to take our land because they wanted it for themselves." He looked up. "Are they going to?" he asked. "No." He went back to the oatmeal, considered. "Did you stop them?" "With help," she said. He nodded. Like this was information he was filing. "The man who was here," he said. "Mr. Briggs." Yes, he helped. He knew grandfather, he did. They were friends for a long time. Jasper ate another spoonful. Then, is he going to come back? She looked at her son. At the 5-year-old face with her husband's jaw and her father's eyes, the specific inheritance of children, the way they are assembled from the people who came before them, the way those people persist in the most ordinary expressions, and the angle of a head and the quality of attention in a look. "I think so," she said. "If we ask him." Jasper seemed satisfied with this. He finished his oatmeal. He got down from the table and went to put his coat on carefully, correctly, every button, and went out to help with the morning chores. Because he was Jasper Calloway, and he had been raised on a farm, and chores were simply part of the structure of mornings and didn't require deliberation. She watched him go, and then she sat alone at the kitchen table for a few minutes in the morning light, not thinking, not planning, not calculating the next step or the step after that, just sitting. In the house her father had built, on the land her father had kept, with the documents now safely in the federal system and the inquiry underway and the weight of the last 8 years not gone, not resolved. That was too clean, too final, but distributed, shared, carried by the right people in the right places instead of hidden under a floor where it couldn't do what it was meant to do, she thought. He would have hated all of this. And then he would have pretended to hate it. And then, with the small involuntary smile that arrived, before she could decide whether to allow it. But he would have been proud. Callum came out to the farm that afternoon. She had sent word through Meredith, a brief note, the economy of language she was realizing she had inherited alongside the stubbornness and the instinct for terrain. "Come when you can." He came at 2 o'clock, tied his horse at the post, walked across the yard in the October light that was doing the particular thing it did in the middle of the month, cold and golden, at the same time, the last warmth of the year, wearing its best clothes before it left entirely. She was sitting on the porch steps. He sat beside her. For a while they just looked at the property, the barn, the workshop, the kitchen garden, stripped and resting, the long grass of the field moving slightly in a wind that was cold enough to mean business. "Devereaux is satisfied with the filing," Callum said. "I know. He sent word. The inquiry is going to take time. I know that too, some of the other families. Will be contacted," she said. "I know." She looked at the field. "I'm not worried about what comes next. I know what comes next. It's not fast, and it's not simple, and it doesn't fix everything, but it's real." She paused. "That's enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Then your father said that. More than once. When we were working together, something would go right, not completely right, not the complete resolution, just a piece of it falling into place, and he would say, 'That's enough for today. Move to the next thing.' He said it to me too." She looked at the workshop. "Usually when I was frustrated that something wasn't done all the way, he'd say, 'Enough for today. The rest is tomorrow.' He was right. He was usually right. About the practical things." She paused. "Less right about the other things." "Which other things?" She looked at him. "The things he thought he could protect people from by keeping quiet. The things he was wrong about silence being able to hold." Callum nodded slowly. She thought about what to say next. She had been thinking about it since the morning. The specific thing she wanted to say, in the specific order she wanted to say it, directly. without the easing in that her father had used, and that she had decided was not her method. He made you carry something for 8 years, she said. The story of his death, the belief that you'd failed to protect him, the 8 years of not knowing. She looked at Callum directly. That wasn't your fault, and it wasn't his fault. Exactly, he did what he thought he had to do, and he did it badly, which is different from doing it wrongly. But it cost you something. She paused. I wanted to say that. Callum looked at the field. A long silence. Yes, he said. Just that. The word a man says, when the thing being named is real, and has been real, and doesn't need elaboration. He knew it cost you, she said. He said so. In the letter. He said a lot of things in the letter. Did he say the right things? Callum thought about that. Genuinely thought about it, which she appreciated the not automatic answer. The consideration. He said enough, Callum said. It wasn't everything, but it was what he had. And it was. It was him. Saying it in his way. Your father's way of saying things was specific. You knew when he was being real, because he was never real about small things. So when he was real, it landed differently. She understood that. She had grown up with that specific quality. He told me, she said slowly, that the teaching was the love. All of it. Everything he taught me. She looked at her hands, the calluses. The history of work. I spent a long time wishing he'd said it more directly. Just said, I love you. Said it plainly. She paused. I understand it now. But I still think he should have said it plainly. He should have, Callum agreed. Did he say it to you? No. A beat. But he came back for me. In 1868, when I was pinned down near the creek, he came back. He didn't say the words, but he came back. She looked at him. You told me, he said, I still have my horse. Yes, that's what he said when you asked why he came back. Yes. That's not a small thing, she said. For him. That sentence. She thought about her father. About the economy of what he said. The weight he put into small things because he didn't distribute the weight across large things. He was telling you, I have the means to help you, and I'm using them. That was as close as he got. Callum was quiet. Yes, he said again. Differently this time. The word carrying more than it had the first time. The wind moved through the field. The dry stalks of the stripped kitchen garden rattled faintly. Somewhere on the far side of the barn, Jasper was making the particular sounds of a 5-year-old engaged with something that required physical effort and vocal commentary. Wren listened to those sounds. Then she said the thing she had been building toward. I'm going to stay. I know, Callum said, and I'm going to rebuild the damaged barn section. Before winter. She looked at the burned-out framing. I can do most of it myself, but some of it, I'll help, he said, not waiting for the end of the sentence. I told you that at the start. Nothing has changed. She looked at him. He looked at her. In his face the lined, weathered, thoroughly lived-in face of a 66-year-old man who had worn a badge for 14 years and built a business and carried a loss and received a letter from a dead man and helped a widow he had never met do something that required doing. She saw her father, not literally, not as resemblance or echo, but as the thing her father had trusted. Gideon Calloway had trusted this man. Across 8 years in silence and a false death, had trusted him enough to send the gun, had trusted him enough to know that when the gun arrived, Callum would understand, and when he understood, he would act. And he had, which was the most direct thing her father had ever said about any person. He always said, she told Callum, that the best thing you could know about someone was how they behaved when it cost them something. Callum looked at her, waiting. You didn't have to do any of this, she said. The filing, the documents, riding out to the farm with Harker following, sitting in Devereaux's office and giving your name and your history and your professional account of 8 years ago. She held his eyes. It cost you. Everything worth doing costs something, he said. I know. She looked back at the field. I wanted you to know that I know. He nodded. They sat on the porch steps in the October afternoon. The light was going. The temperature was going with it. The sky in the west was taking on that flat, pale quality. The clouds arranged in a line that said, something is coming, and what is coming is serious, but not today. Jasper appeared from around the barn, covered in something, moving at the specific velocity of a child who has accomplished a task and is now in search of acknowledgement. He stopped when he saw Callum, looked at him seriously. Callum looked back with equal seriousness. Did you know my grandfather? Jasper asked. I did, Callum said, for a long time. What was he like? Callum thought about it. The real thought, not the automatic answer. He was the kind of man, Callum said, who came back. Jasper considered this. His 5-year-old face doing the work of a child, processing a sentence that contains more than its words. What does that mean? It means, Callum said, that when it was hard to go back when going forward, would have been easier he went back anyway. He looked at the child with the complete seriousness the question deserved, because someone needed him to. Jasper nodded, filed it, looked at his mother. I'm cold, he announced. Then go get your second coat, she said. He went. She watched him disappear into the house. The door swinging shut behind him with the particular domestic sound of a door in a house that is lived in. The sound of a place that is home. She looked at Callum. He was watching the door too. My father used to tell that story about you, she said. The one about the creek. I know. You told me. He looked at her. By the third telling it was a storm. He kept adding rain, because the rain was the part that mattered to him, not the facts of it, the feeling of it. Callum turned back to the field. He was riding back in the dark in whatever the actual weather was, towards someone who needed him. That's what he was trying to say. She understood. She had always understood. She had just needed time to understand that she understood. The barn section, she said, returning to the practical, because the practical was also what mattered, was also how love worked, was also, she was beginning to believe her father's lesson, made fully clear at last. If you come Saturday, we can get the frame assessed at least. Saturday, Callum said. Yes. He stood up, picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the step, looked out at the property one more time, the sweep of it, the land that Gideon Calloway had worked for 8 years under a wrong name, that Wren Calloway was keeping under the right one. He would have been proud, Callum said. I know, she said, which was not arrogance, which was just the truth. 3 weeks later, Devereaux sent word. Gantry had resigned his position as territorial judge, not under duress voluntarily, which was the arrangement that had been arrived at, through the kind of negotiation that happens when a man understands that his alternative is significantly worse and decides to find the version of this situation that allows him to retain a small portion of his dignity. He left Laramie quietly, with very little. Going east, someone said. Nobody knew exactly where, and nobody who knew was saying. Raines faced federal charges. His lawyers were fighting with the specific vigor of people being paid very well to fight. It would take time. It would take years, probably. The outcome was uncertain in its specific contours. But the land records were federal now. The fraud was documented. The families named in the contract had been contacted by Devereaux's office. Some of the land was already gone, sold, transferred, built on, beyond recovering through any realistic legal mechanism. Some of it wasn't. That sum was something, was enough to start. The barn section was finished by the end of October. Callum came Saturday, as he had said, and the Saturday after. He was not a carpenter, she was not either, not a skilled one, but they were both people who understood that most things could be done if you understood the principles, and were willing to learn the rest as it became necessary. Gus Alderman from the neighboring farm came and helped on the second Saturday, without being asked, simply appearing with tools and opinions about structural integrity that were more useful than his opinions usually were. His wife had been watching Jasper. His involvement was the natural extension of a relationship between neighboring families that had survived because both parties had decided at some point that surviving together was better than surviving separately. Jasper helped, in the specific way that 5-year-olds help, which is to say, not efficiently, not with precision, occasionally counterproductively, but with a complete commitment to participation that made the work, in some ways Wren could not fully articulate, more real than it would have been without him. On the second Saturday, late afternoon, with the frame up and the roof board starting, Callum handed Jasper a hammer, a small one, appropriate size. Jasper looked at it with the focused seriousness of a child, encountering a tool for the first time as something given, not borrowed. Hold it here, Callum said, showing him, not at the end, here, more control. Jasper adjusted his grip, tried the motion, missed the nail completely. Tried again, hit the wood, not the nail. Third try. The nail went in half an inch. Jasper looked at it, looked at Callum, looked at his mother. Again? He said. Again, Callum said. And again. November arrived. The first real cold. The kind that meant winter was not coming eventually, but was in fact here, had arrived, was settling in for its Wyoming duration. Wren had the barn section finished, had the south fence tight, had the kitchen garden put properly to bed, had enough wood stacked for the coldest months, and a plan for the rest. She had Devereaux's address in Cheyenne. She had written to him twice and received 2 replies, each confirming that the inquiry was proceeding. She had Callum's presence on Saturdays, which had become a fact of the week, without either of them specifically deciding it would be. He came, he worked, he stayed for supper, he rode back to Laramie before dark. It was the arrangement of people who have decided, without discussing the decision, that the arrangement is right. She had Jasper, growing, daily, in the incremental and absolute way of children, adding vocabulary and capability and questions and the specific gravity of a small person who is becoming more himself every morning. He had learned to hit the nail on the 3rd try, then the 2nd, and this happened in the last week of October, and she saw it happen and filed it in the category of things she was going to carry with her the 1st. He had asked about his grandfather twice more. Both times she had told him something true. Not everything true. Not yet. But something. The something got bigger each time, which was, she thought, how it was supposed to work. The last evening of October, she was sitting on the porch after Jasper was in bed. The temperature was in the low 20s. She was wearing 2 coats and not regretting it. The sky was completely clear in the way that Wyoming skies are clear on cold, dry nights, the stars not just visible but present, imposing, the specific visual density of a sky that has nothing between you and the rest of the universe. In her pocket was the bank draft. $1,500. Northern Rangeland Consortium. Cole Rains. The signature of a man whose signature was now attached to federal fraud charges. She took it out, looked at it. She had been deciding what to do with it since the day she put it in her pocket. Had thought about tearing it up. Had thought about keeping it as evidence. Had thought about what the 1,500 represented, the value they placed on her family's removal. The number they had settled on as sufficient to make her disappear. She folded it once, twice. She set it on the porch railing. The wind came up. Cold. Direct. Wyoming cold, which did not apologize for itself. The bank draft lifted off the porch railing. Floated. Came down in the dead garden below the porch, face up in the starlight. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went inside. Because the cold was real. Because Jasper would be up early. Because there was work tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Because the barn was sound, and the winter was here. And the land was hers. And life was the specific, ongoing, ordinary accumulation of days that asked you to keep showing up for them. She kept showing up. She always had. The gun was on the mantelpiece. She had put it there after she'd brought it back from Callum's shop, repaired now. The hammer mechanism sound, the trigger pull correct, the whole instrument returned to the working condition her father had maintained it in. For the years it had been his. It was hers now. Had always been hers, really. Her father had just been keeping it until she was ready to carry it. She stood in front of the fireplace for a moment, looking at it. The initials on the grip. GWC. The careful, deliberate carving of a man who had wanted something to last. It had lasted. She looked at it, the way you look at something that has traveled a long distance to arrive in your hands, with the particular respect for the journey. Then she turned away from the mantelpiece, walked to the window, looked out at the property dark now, the stars giving just enough light to make out the line of the barn against the sky, the fence posts along the north line, the long grass moving in the wind. 160 acres. Her father had come here under a wrong name and made it into something. She was going to keep it that way, under the right name, with the right records, with a federal inquiry in progress and a U.S. Marshal who knew the story, and a 66-year-old man with a stiff finger and a left side draw, who showed up every Saturday. And with Jasper, growing up on the same land, learning to hit a nail on the 1st try, asking questions about a grandfather he would only ever know through the people who had loved him, which was, she thought, enough. More than enough. It was everything. She went to bed. Because tomorrow was tomorrow, and tomorrow she was going to need to be ready for it. She was always ready. That, too, was her father's.